This conference will now be recorded.
I'm going to turn to the gentleman to my left, and we'll go around the table first, and then we'll do that table second.
Great, thanks. Chris Hoagland, Air Director at MDE, supporting the council, succeeding Tad Aburn in some ways really trying not to. Next.
Good morning, everyone. Todd Chasen from Gordon Feinblatt on behalf of the Maryland Chamber of Commerce.
Hi, everybody. I'm Anna Marshall, representing Baltimore Metropolitan Council, and happy to be here. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Megan Latshaw. I work at Johns Hopkins in the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering, and I am here to represent the Maryland Children's Environmental Health Protection Advisory Council.
I'm Cynthia Marshall. I work 3 people power organizations in Maryland, AIM, ACT, and PATH. And we have been working on environmental issues and are here for the BEPS hearing.
Hi, I'm Catherine Manhart. I am on the clergy staff at St. James Episcopal Church in Potomac, and here to support AIM and for the BEPS as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Pilar and I am a community organizer working for Action in Montgomery.
Hi, I am Sevin Yengo with Action in Montgomery.
Hi everyone, I'm Shella Khan and I'm from PATH, People Acting Together in Howard County.
Randy Mosier, the Deputy Program Manager for the Air Quality Planning Program.
Hi, I'm Kelsey Cisco, a Natural Resources Planner in the Air Quality Planning Program.
Hi, Sunny Park, working at Legan Beach, here to represent American Institute of Chemical Engineers.
Hi, I'm Ross Solowich, University of Maryland. I do atmospheric chemistry, and John, I thank you for leading us with such class for so many years.
Larry Schoen, Schoen Engineering in Columbia, Maryland, serving for the American Society of Mechanical Engineers.
Sunny from University of Maryland School of Medicine.
Can we start over here? I can't see. Is someone down there?
Hi, sorry. I'm Carolyn Jones. I'm with the Regulation Development Division with MDE.
I'm Dave Kramer with Genon Power Generator in Maryland, and I also want to add my 2 cents. It's been a pleasure working with John, another electric utility person, and all the always giving us a fair shake, I think, in all the work we've done with the community.
Bring up the screen.
Art Stewart, Climate Change Program, MDE.
Allison Jaden, Special Project Manager with the Climate Change Program at MDE.
Scott Samarco, Climate Change.
Catherine Zavala, I'm Emily Bull, I am Chief Planning and Policy.
I'm John Artisan, my program manager. Glenn, Division Chief, MDE.
So I'm the right compliance program here as well. I don't want to add something, John. I'm the Secretary Walsh, we're babysitter. So with the grants are on now, I'm sure you will do a fine job with that. This your technical skills and what you contribute to.
Just a point of reference, Secretary Walsh was the Secretary of Maryland Department of the Environment when I was here, and he had a unique interest, perverse sometimes interest in power plants, and he would always want to go visit a power plant, but he'd usually bring his brat son with us. And his brat son, if there was some reason that you had to remove him because he was hitting his father in the face or hitting me in the face, and we had to remove him from the public area, I would take him into the back room and play with him. And I was mildly famous here for a while because of my ability to babysit. So I decided to have kids and see if I could do it on my own. Can we go over here?
Sure. Good morning, Eric Ellison, Director of EHS, Maryland State College.
Jordan Miller, Future Fanscope. I'm here running the camera.
Brandon Jackson, Fanscope, running
Good morning, everyone. Jose Coronado, Climate Policy Analyst from CASA.
If I could ask that everyone, there's a sign-in sheet. It really helps the process if everyone takes the time to sign into that sheet. You're already on record for being here, but it makes it easier to recount and keep in touch with people. And secondly, with that, if you wish to sign up to speak, if you could notify that there. It doesn't preclude you from speaking later, but it makes us able to organize the day right. And just a reminder of how we operate. We're going to have staff presentations. The council's going to interact with staff with questions, and then we'll go beyond the council. And if members of the public that aren't members of the council wish to speak, it'd be really good if we can use the sheet, but even if not, we'll make an opportunity. But we're going to ask you to limit your comments to 3 minutes. And that doesn't sound like too much. Remember, this is a preview and a recommendation to the department. There's a public process that follows even after this. This is a useful tool to the department and to the public. And it's just the first step in many.
Introduction of those people online.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, if we could have the people online introduced, I apologize for that.
We have a number, so maybe we start with the council members. How many participants do we have total on the webinar right now?
69.
Yeah, so maybe we'll
Council members.
stick with the council members online.
Oh, thank you.
for now.
I didn't know it was that many.
Yep.
Sure, I'll start. Good morning, everyone. I'm Nicole Cook. I'm the Agricultural and Environmental Legal Faculty Specialist at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore Extension, and I represent our agricultural and natural resources farming communities.
Tom Denoga, Prince George's County Council Chair, and with Maryland Washington Council of Governments.
Weston Young, I represent the Maryland Association of Counties, and wishing you well in retirement, John.
All right, next up on the agenda is approval of council minutes. Members of the council, I'll pause 30 seconds in case you don't remember looking at them, but you received them from Kelsey last week. And anybody have any comments on them? I'd sure like to hear, and then I'll entertain a motion to accept.
While we're pausing, can you remind us the password for guest Wi-Fi?
1800 wash.
Okay, capital W or no?
So I'm not seeing a lot of interest in adding. Anybody have anything they want to discuss in the minutes? I understand a motion to approve. Is there a second? There's a second. Last chance for discussion. Any changes? All in favor of accepting? Can we have the council?
But it's not.
Yes.
Everybody on board on the phone, council? I see your hand. There you go. Thank you. You're this big if you wonder why I'm having trouble. Thank you. So minutes are approved. I didn't turn it over to you, and I'm so sorry. Introductions from.
It's okay. It's your special day, John. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you. We've got another fun one, as people have mentioned today. As a reminder, we've been doing a lot of climate work this year, right? In March, you all considered advanced clean cars too. In June, advanced clean trucks, and now here we are in September, the long-awaited building energy performance standards. Hopefully, we're coming up on the end of this summer. It's been a heck of a summer. I'm sure everyone has seen what's happened all around the world this year, and there's been some helpful roundups of just the evidence of extreme weather that we've seen this summer. And I direct you to those. The council, of course, discussed at length some of the impacts we saw in Maryland this year, including from the extraordinary Canadian wildfire season, which caused us to measure the worst air quality we've ever measured here in Maryland when we were in the smoke plume. So this long, hot summer has been a reminder of the importance of the work that this group does, the progress it's made under the last several decades in cleaning up the air, and the new challenges we face, especially from climate change. And so here, the year after the state passed the Climate Solutions Now Act, this council's agenda has been packed with really significant action on climate change. So today continues that with the building energy performance standards. You all have been briefed on that several times, but today's the day you're considering the regulatory proposal in full, and we're really looking forward to your advice on that important measure. And I won't say anything that hasn't already been said about John, good or bad, but we're grateful, John, and looking forward to you steering us home here today and your last hurrah.
Thank you very much. Our first action item is scheduled. Randy, you're going to do a presentation on non-trading large nitrogen oxide units.
That was a mouthful, John. Yes, and thank you. This is going to be a very quick, just a minor amendment that we have to do to one of our regulations. As John mentioned, this is an amendment to 261140. It's our NOx ozone season emission caps for non-trading large NOx units. So essentially, this is a regulation that's born out of the standing federal programs of the NOx SIP call, the NOx budget and trading programs, which evolved into the Clean Air Interstate Rural Care and ultimately into the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, which primarily focused on electric generating units, coal-fired power plants and the like. But there was also a provision that was set aside for large boilers, items that were above 250 MMBTU. And at the time, Maryland had only identified one source of being subject to that rule, and that was the Luke paper mill out in Western Maryland. And going through a more recent exercise, I believe it was in 2018, we had identified several other boilers that were subject to that rule. And essentially, this rule is something that's set in place to set a budget cap upon those type of industry so that they couldn't produce a certain amount of NOx beyond that limit, which for Maryland was 1,014 tons of NOx. So all of those, or at least all of the tonnage was allocated to the Luke paper mill. But in doing our paperwork exercise and having people recalculate, it was 656 tons, I believe, that was allocated towards the Luke paper mill. But we also had a boiler at American Sugar, a boiler at the National Institute of Health, and boilers at the Cove Point liquid natural gas facility. So essentially in 2020, Luke paper mill shut down, correct, Steve? Thank you. And with the Luke paper mill shutting down, that freed up those 656 tons from that. So it was just reestablishing those credits into what's called the new unit set aside. So should another source need to come into the state or something of that nature, those NOx credits are available for that. Keep it at the cap. Not that we're envisioning that, but that's how it works. So essentially, that's the only amendment that we're doing is amending that table so that it's reflective of that and also pointing to a more general reference of the federal program, 40 CFR 5121. Looking at Carolyn because she always knows these things better than I. If I didn't say it correctly, it's correct in your notes. But it's so that if the federal program changes now, we're pointing more to a direct reference, so we don't have to go in and necessarily amend our regulations every time Casper updates. Is that good enough? Good.
You've got
and
allocations right there.
And here are the allocations and the way the table looks in the amendments. Any questions from this action? Please.
My normal question as are affected entities involved in the conversation, and I'm more interested in the other people in the NOx budget rule than perhaps the ones that went out of business. Does it impact them, and are they supportive?
Not in the least, and no, we did not reach out because it was not an action that was going to have an impact upon any other stakeholder. It was just with the Luke mill closing down, what was allocated to that facility now went to the new unit set aside. We had a very extensive process when we made our amendments to the reg in 2018 and involved them to work with the department in doing their calculations. So there's no further impact upon those sources.
It doesn't change the allowance prices for other people?
It should not. There's no prices associated.
Okay, thank you. Any other council members have questions? Has anyone signed up, Carolyn, to speak on this rule? You have the sheet?
Not on this rule, yeah.
Okay. Is there anyone that would like an opportunity now to speak on it? Not seeing any. I would open it up for council discussion, but since there's no questions and it seems to be a narrow, non-impactful change, I'll entertain a motion. Motion to approve,
Second.
right? We have the second. All in favor? Thank you.
Thank you. Online, yeah.
Now, I hope the next one goes as fast.
Yeah, the next one ought to be just the same.
All right, this is the Building Energy Performance Standard, and Mark Stewart and Allison are going to present this. And just to remind you, we're going to have the interaction between staff and the council initially, and then I'll expand it after that discussion takes place to others. So try to keep in your seats. Oh, I'm sorry.
If you're done, I just wanted to.
Yeah, I'm done.
Sure. I just wanted to let the council know that I will not be participating in this discussion as a consequence of my partners presenting on the issue, and I will be abstaining from the vote. So I'm going to sit here, I'm going to listen, but I won't be participating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Mark Stewart, Climate Change Program Manager at MDE. It's good seeing you again. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the components of the Building Energy Performance Standards. We've been briefing the council on this last 9 months now, so a lot of the presentation material is actually kind of a recap for the council members. A couple of additional slides that we've added in to help round out, the components of the Building Energy Performance Standards. So next slide. So presentation that I'll give walks through, first of all, background on what are Building Energy Performance Standards and the extensive stakeholder process that we use to develop these. We will then go through briefly the proposed regulatory requirements, and then I'll turn it to one of our technical consultants on this project, Josh Case from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, to talk about the technical analysis that the lab conducted to support this rulemaking. And then I'll come back and talk about the regulatory schedule, next steps, and then we'll take any discussion and questions that you might have. Slide.
I don't know why it's not going. I'm sorry. There we go.
This is good. So Building Energy Performance Standards, or Building Performance Standards, goes by BEPS in either case. It's, the acronym is either BEPS or BPS, depending on where you are around the country. These are emerging as important tools to help reduce energy consumption in buildings and decrease greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. The typical goal is to improve energy efficiency and or lower greenhouse gas emissions. The Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022 requires MDE to develop BEPS regulations, including energy use intensity standards and direct emission reduction standards. Decarbonizing large buildings is, of course, an important component of the state's goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide. The Climate Solutions Now Act, you can go to the next slide, also gave the state of Maryland the nation's most ambitious goals of any state to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Maryland is already a climate leader. We've reduced greenhouse gas emissions statewide about 30% since 2006, remarkably cleaning up our air along the way. We now aim to achieve a 60% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2031 and achieve net zero emissions by 2045. These are not just soft commitments. This is written in statute. MDE is required to and other agencies to adopt regulations to achieve those GHG reduction goals. Next slide. Maryland joined the National Building Performance Coalition, which is an initiative of the White House. A few months ago, we joined California, Colorado, and Washington at the state level for being part of this coalition. There are a number of jurisdictions in Maryland that are also part of the coalition, including Annapolis, Montgomery County, Prince George's County, and notably Washington, D.C., not in Maryland, but an important neighbor of ours. So When the Climate Solutions Now Act passed in April of 2022, we quickly got moving to secure technical assistance. We reached out to partners at the U.S. Department of Energy, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Pacific Northwest National Lab, the Institute for Market Transformation, the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partners, and so on, to get as much no-cost technical assistance as possible, because at that point we hadn't received any budget or positions to implement BEPS. So we're grateful that we got a lot of technical support right off the bat to develop this, but very quickly we started to realize we had a lot of questions and we needed to get answers. So we went through the fall and developed a bunch of stakeholder outreach sessions to get input to help us develop the building energy performance standards. We held 14 stakeholder meetings in November and December, meeting with 419 individuals across 329 different organizations to get input to develop these standards. We, of course, briefed this council in December of 2022, March and June of 2023. We've also developed and posted videos and informational webinars to get more information out about the building energy performance standards, the requirements that are already set in law for these standards, including the direct emission reductions that are required for covered buildings, the fact that we are required to implement energy use intensity standards within these regulations. And we launched this last summer, a building energy transition implementation task force in partnership with the Maryland Energy Administration to develop recommendations to see that recommendations are going to be forwarded to the Governor and General Assembly by December 1st of this year on the incentives that should be made available to help building owners comply with these standards.
Can I ask just a clarifying question? Sure. So we all have the same base of knowledge. When you've used the term direct emissions a couple of times, can you describe what you mean by that?
Yes, although there might actually be a slide on it. Let me hold on to that question, and then one of the slides explains the two different standards that we were required to implement, and I'll describe it because, of course, it's actually net direct greenhouse gas emissions, and net direct is a creative term that we've needed to flesh out. So we'll get to that in a second. Yep. Next slide. Thanks. We also shared, we took the unusual step of sharing a draft of this regulation last spring. So from May to June, we sent around a draft, collected input on that draft to better improve it, right? Because this is a significant regulation. It has a lot of entities that are covered under it. We received 60 comments from organizations to that draft regulation. Those comments were really helpful for improving key aspects of it, including creating an affordable housing definition and the opportunity for affordable housing providers to apply for an exemption, clarifications to how electric and gas companies report data to customers, clarifications in the definition section of the regulation, and then some updates to the standards. The comments that we received were also very helpful for helping us create the technical guidance that is a supplement to the regulation. That really is more of the manual on, the step-by-step of how a building owner would go through this. And we shared all those comments online. So the timeline from here, of course, this is old hat for the council here, but today is the first day of the formal proposal and adoption process. The next step would be to publish a proposed regulation in the register. The adoption process is a 6 to 12 month process, and we plan to do continued development of the technical guidance over the coming years to further improve the specific guidance that we provide to the building owners. Next slide. All right, so what is BEPS? First of all, what we're proposing today is a new subtitle, subtitle 28, the Building Energy Performance Standards. It includes 4 different chapters: definitions and documents incorporated by reference, benchmarking and reporting, performance standards, and compliance demonstration. And then chapter 4 is alternative compliance and special provisions. So a covered building is a building in Maryland that is 35,000 square feet or larger, excluding the parking garage area. There are several categories of buildings that are exempt. These were exempt in statute. Buildings, of course, that are smaller than 35,000 square feet are exempt. Historic buildings, those are buildings that are designated as historic properties by federal, state, or local law. Public or non-public elementary and secondary school buildings, manufacturing buildings, and agricultural buildings. Also worth noting, we probably included this somewhere on the slides, but food service facilities within covered buildings are also exempt from these standards. We estimate there are approximately 9,000 covered buildings in Maryland. They're located in every county of our state. Of course, we have a high concentration of those buildings in urban areas and along major highway corridors. Montgomery County is the county that has the greatest number of covered buildings among the counties in Maryland. Next slide. The most typical types of covered buildings in Maryland are warehouses. More than 2,000 of our covered buildings are warehouses, office buildings, multifamily housing, and retail stores. Those are the most typical, but there's a wide distribution, of course, of different building types that are covered by this regulation. The process that the owner of a covered building or their representative would go through is beginning in 2025, they would use a benchmarking tool called the Energy Star Portfolio Manager. This is a free tool that is commonly used by building owners and their managers. There are thousands of buildings in Maryland that are already voluntarily using this tool to benchmark their building performance. It's also the tool that Montgomery County, just about every other jurisdiction that has a benchmarking program, is using for their buildings. So beginning of 2025, covered buildings would begin reporting their data, energy use data and other data to MDE. And then they would get some insight at that point, if they haven't already started benchmarking, what's my EUI, or I'm sorry, energy use intensity, that we will next hour or so be referring to that as EUI. And then also, what are my direct or net direct greenhouse gas emissions? And once they have some insight into those, they can compare those with the standards that are published in the regulation and determine, do I need to do anything over the next 17 years to achieve these standards? Important to note, about 1 in 3 buildings, covered buildings, we estimate have already achieved the net direct emissions standards. Another 30% of buildings or so have already achieved the final site EUI standards. So roughly speaking, 1 in 3 buildings will look at those standards and once they start their benchmarking, if they haven't already, and say, oh, wow, this regulation means very little for us in terms of building improvements that we need to make. By 2030, starting in 2030, they need to begin achieving the standards that we set. So the interim standards begin in 2030. And of course, if a building is not meeting those standards, they would have the option to pay an alternative compliance fee for the emissions or pay a penalty for any overage of the EUI standards that are set for that year. The benchmarking tool I mentioned is the Energy Star Portfolio Manager tool. You can go on.
Sorry.
Yeah. This is actually more, if you're a building owner, if you know building owners, please encourage them to create a free account, start using this free tool. Again, many buildings are already benchmarking, but we're really trying to get the information out there. If you're not already looking at and understanding what's your energy use, please do so now. So what are the specific standards? The law requires that covered buildings reduce net direct greenhouse gas emissions by achieving a 20% reduction as compared with 2025 levels for average buildings of similar construction. It's a little bit wordy. I know I've described this to the council in the past, but what that means is for average buildings of similar construction, we'll start on that part of that sentence. That means that we take all of, let's say, the warehouses that we have data for currently and say, okay, well, what's the median energy use for all of the warehouses, right? And the standard set for the warehouse property type needs to correspond with basically the average or the median energy use for all of those warehouses currently. And so we did that for every single property type. And by we, I actually mean the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, did that for every single property type and came up with standards that correspond to and per property type. Yep.
Sorry to be a stickler and a pain.
Median versus average?
Yep.
Yeah. There, yes, notably, there's a difference. There's the norm, of course, and you will appreciate and understand the value of taking the median versus the average. It's a much truer, using the median is the standard in these
So
programs.
So that should have said median.
You know, we interpreted that to allow us to take the median because that is the standard, and it is based on the stakeholder feedback that we're getting, also the preferred approach.
I agree because it gets rid of the influence of outliers.
Right.
So all good.
Yeah.
And the median, while we're on that, the median was nationwide or Maryland only?
Lawrence Berkeley National Lab used Maryland-specific data to do their target setting analysis for us. So it's Maryland-specific.
I'm just surprised they have that large a database on Maryland.
Again, there are a lot of, a big lift here is that buildings in Montgomery County have been benchmarked for years. There's required benchmarking, a benchmarking requirement that Montgomery County has. So we had, I forget the number, upwards of 2,000 buildings from Montgomery County alone that created a large sample size. But more broadly, there are buildings statewide that are benchmarking, and that data was provided from EPA to Lawrence Berkeley National Lab to really flesh out a pretty robust data set for Maryland covered buildings.
I don't want to get too deep into the details. That's necessarily a skewed and biased. Buildings that are measuring their performance are more likely to be more efficient.
Yep, and when our consultants at LB&L get on, they can perhaps explain the process that they use to determine the bias, but that was also controlled for in this or considered in this. So sorry, I'm getting long-winded here. So there are net direct emission standards that requires a 20% reduction as compared with 2025 levels. But what we did, or what LB&L did, was modeled what the 2025 energy consumption would be. And let me just pause right there, that we are being very clear with stakeholders that when the actual 2025 data is in 2026, we will need to reevaluate these standards because it's very important that the standards are set on those 2025 levels. At this point, we've used model 2025. We intend to use actual 2025, but that won't be ready until 2026, which means we're talking about a regulatory change at the earliest in 2027. And it's very important that building owners have some clarity around where to aim for 2030, well before 2027. There's a 60% reduction compared to 2025 levels by 2035. And then the law requires that each and every covered building achieve net zero direct emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. The law also required that we use, that we set EUI standards, or energy use intensity standards. What we did there was, following the lead of other jurisdictions, we used, and by we again, I mean Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, used an off-the-shelf methodology to calculate what the standards would be, what final standards would be. And in our case, we said, okay, well, it's similar to the net zero emission standard being set in 2040, we'll set a final EUI standard in 2040. And then what buildings will need to do is in 2025, they'll establish their baseline performance. How am I performing today compared with the standard in 2040? And then there's a straight line trajectory that's drawn from your baseline performance today to the final performance in 2040. And you're basically just making continuous improvement in 2030 and 2035 to achieve the 2040 target. What that means is that if a building has really high performance compared with the baseline, they might be on a steeper trajectory to need to achieve the final standard. Again, 1/3 of buildings or so are already going to be at or below that final standard and have to do nothing. Some buildings will be, modestly above and have relatively little to do to achieve the final standard 17 years from now. Next slide. I touched on this already. So we'll be reevaluating the standards once the actual 2025 data is in, which at the earliest will be the later half of 2026. When you look at the regulation, you see the standards laid out in a table, and we didn't want to give you all of the many, many columns of standards that were set, but instead just a quick orientation to the header for that table to orient you to, there's a listing of property types. So for instance, non-refrigerated warehouses would be one of the property types that shows up on that list. And then you have the interim standard, the emission standards set in first. The interim standard for the 2030 to 2034 period is the first number that you see in that column. That is the standard that a building needs to achieve by 2030, and that standard remains fixed for a 5-year period, right? 2030 through 2034, there's no decrease in that standard. Basically, just achieve the 2030 standard all the way through the end of 2034. Then the interim standards decrease for 2035 through 2039. And then you'll see that every building that's required by law has a standard of 0 CO2 emissions by 2040 across the board. And then the final column, you'll see that there's a final standard, final site EUI standard set for 2040. And again, as I described earlier, we only set the final standard because each building is going to determine their starting point and then set a straight line trajectory to the final standard, right? So that the interim standards, in other words, are unique for each and every building based on their baseline performance. Next slide. We created specific exemptions for buildings to be exempt from the standards. If a building is in financial distress, if the covered building was not occupied in the year that is being reported, or if the covered building was demolished during the calendar year for which benchmarking is required, those buildings would be exempt from these standards. There's also an exemption from establishing the baseline performance. We have the condition right now where there are some, and especially office buildings, that have low occupancy rates. If a building has low occupancy rates, they can be exempt from establishing their baseline performance. We want to see that a building is mostly occupied before they set that baseline performance, because of course the occupancy of the building has a significant influence on the total energy use in the building. There's also an exemption for affordable housing providers. If an affordable housing provider can demonstrate that they are seeking program assistance from the state government or federal government to implement projects to improve energy efficiency and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then they can basically turn that into MDE and say, I'm applying for these, here are the projects that I have planned, and then we can provide some flexibility on any alternative compliance payments that they would be due to the department. And this is really important to help ensure that the affordable housing buildings are still required to meet the standards, right? We do want to see that affordable housing buildings are improving their energy efficiency, reducing utility costs for their tenants, but creating some controls so that rents don't increase, especially in affordable housing, right? If that building otherwise has to implement expensive measures, we don't want to see that rents go up for affordable housing. Next slide. We also created a technical manual that was emailed, I think, to the council members perhaps last week. This serves as the department's initial implementation guidelines for covered buildings. The information provides additional background and clarifications and details. We also include some information about the stakeholder process that we use, additional details on benchmarking, reporting, and the standards, so on and so forth. So it's more of the long form explanation of everything that you see in the regulation. right, and then let me turn it over for Josh Case from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab to talk through some of the key findings from the technical analyses.
Great, thank you, Mark. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, we hear you.
Yep.
Great. I believe I enabled sharing my webcam, but apologies if you all can't see me. I think it said I put in a request, so maybe things to be figured out there. But worst case scenario, you can hear me and you can see the slides. So those are the most important things here. And thank you, Mark, for the introduction and the overview here. I will try to speak to a couple of the questions that popped up over the last 10 minutes or so. But just to, I guess, reintroduce myself to this group, I was also here back in March to present on our initial impact analysis and those findings. But my name is Joshua Case. I am a technology researcher at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I am here on behalf of the US DOE EPA BPS Technical Assistance Network. All right, looks like I can share my webcam here. Great, so y'all can see me, put a face to the words that you're hearing. This technical assistance network that I mentioned was stood up in cooperation between the Department of Energy and EPA as a nationwide resource for jurisdictions that are looking to implement regulations exactly like the Maryland BEPS regulation. So we do live and breathe BPS when it comes to both technical analysis to show the impact and value of implementing a building performance standard policy, in addition to the implications as much as it's physically possible. So our focus is very much on the technical side. So we're not here to advise from a policy perspective as to how to set up the structure of your ordinance from that perspective. But if there is a policy component and you are looking to have it modeled out, our network is really adept at being able to take in different policy scenarios and deliver analyses that help inform iterations of that policy over time. So you can hop to the next slide for me. This was the, it's not the most exciting chart in terms of look necessarily, but this was the output that I had discussed during the previous March meeting, which is the essentially the macro impacts of MDE's BEPS policy as defined through a couple of different scenarios. So the red line here defines a business as usual scenario, the left chart representing energy use, the right chart representing emissions. You can see that the chart on the right, you're seeing significant reductions in the red line in the business as usual scenario. This is related to projections of decarbonization of the grid itself. So even if buildings continue exactly as is, these are the reductions that you would be seeing. The blue line represents the incremental benefit of only direct emissions targets, and then the green line represents the impacts of site EUI targets coupled with direct emissions targets. So just to explain what you're looking at here, but I won't belabor this too much as we did present this previously. But the goal was to be able to show some of the macro impacts of implementation of this policy. When we do this modeling effort, everything is done on a building by building basis. The first major component of the analysis is what was touched on previously, which is our baseline stock analysis. So this is taking a covered buildings list, so the number of buildings that are totally covered, without a statewide benchmarking policy. As you all noted, we do have to draw some estimates and fill in certain gaps that may exist. Obviously, as Mark mentioned, Montgomery County was a large source of public information, but we also did work directly with EPA to get aggregated statistics across the state of buildings that have reported in to the portfolio manager platform, ubiquitous state, countrywide platform that's used to benchmark energy use across buildings. Our work does involve studies that have been done around comparing buildings that voluntarily report versus those that have a mandatory reporting requirement. That delta, hopefully looking to address the gap that may exist between voluntary reporting buildings being more energy efficient than those that are required to report. And we also do, even with the statewide benchmarking data on a property type by property type basis, we have to evaluate the sample size of buildings that are available to us and whether that is sufficient to be able to draw an estimate of the existing EUI. So we do, within our technical guidance, have a property type by property, or within our technical memo, I should say, that defines the outputs of our analysis. We have the itemized property type by property type methods that were used. So for property types where data was available, we filled it in as directly as we could. For property types that data was less available, we did leverage nationwide resources. But even when we did do that, so using, I guess this would be for the wonks in the room, CBEX or REX, which is the commercial building and residential building energy consumption surveys that are performed nationwide, the de facto resource that's used for nationally representative and regionally representative energy use in buildings. We leveraged the microdata from the Mid-Atlantic region to fill in the gaps on those property types that didn't have the direct empirical data from Maryland itself. So, always our goal when we're doing analyses like this is to use the best data available to give the best possible insights. Data availability will always be a concern, and it will always lead to levels of uncertainty. But we do think Maryland's approach benchmarking data, once it comes in to iterate on baselines and targets, is a smart approach here. So, after we did this initial stock and impact analysis, we did, as part of the impact analysis, as Mark was saying, deliver iterations relative to different site EU-wide targets and target setting methodologies. The focus of this presentation is to get into our third layer of analysis, which was our cost benefit analysis. But if there are questions around the target setting process, we're happy to field those as appropriate. We also do have a recorded webinar on the website that I do, if you love hearing my voice regale you, walk through step by step the process we use to set site EUI targets per MDE guidance. So you can hop to the next slide. Impacts are an important part of the picture in terms of savings that's being delivered. As I mentioned, our model does go building by building, year by year, in terms of how it reacts to the targets that are being set. So imagine baseline consumption, annualized energy performance, and then targets that define how much each individual building needs to reduce in order to hit the various targets for various compliance periods. In parallel to that effort, our partner lab, the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, had been doing a meta study across the country and then dove very specifically into the state of Maryland to help develop cost data associated with those percentage savings impacts. So, we do have more detail around this process. Obviously, I'm limited in terms of my time here, so I'm not going to get overly into the weeds here, but PNNL has been working with cost data for decades now when it comes to codes, consulting, renovations of buildings, and that type of work, and worked with us to develop essentially prototype cost curves associated with energy conservation measure implementation. So if you could imagine a curve that shows relatively lower costs associated with the first 5 or 10% savings at a building, assuming that there's low-hanging fruit available, things like lighting upgrades, control upgrades, operational changes. But as you then look for deeper and deeper savings within a building, costs are going to increase pretty dramatically, as you might imagine, as you're looking to replace real systems within buildings. And so by taking PNNL's cost curves that were developed, in addition to electrification retrofit estimates, so this is electrification of hot water systems in addition to space heating systems in buildings were all implemented within the impact model. Since we know what years buildings need to make certain changes in order to hit certain targets, to develop a much more holistic cost benefit analysis. And so you could hop to the next slide. This analysis, I will note, I'll start with the caveat at the bottom, which is that you could never use this analysis to look at an individual building and say, this is what it's going to cost for you to comply. There's far too many variables and unknowns within an individual building. There's estimates around even the baseline consumption that we're using. And so these are not relevant to individual specific buildings. That said, for the purposes of understanding here, I am showing one specific building from the interior of our model, more as a prototype than as a specific building and its pathway. But the general idea here is that you're looking at a cost benefit analysis. This is not anything too fancy here, but year by year you're seeing investment costs in the blue column. So this is as determined by the P&L cost models, the amount of money that is invested into the building to achieve various reduction targets. The other columns, so the orange and the gray, represent the savings associated with those investments. And so you could see here, we did try to pick a building here that had relatively high gas consumption and would be put into a position where they needed to electrify systems early on. This gives you an indicative example that's a little bit more conservative than your average building, because the earlier you electrify, you're not necessarily going to see big savings because of existing gas and electric rates where they stand today, whereas in the future, gas rates are projected to increase more than electric rates are, generally speaking. And so you see some modest savings through 2033, but not to the point where the building is able to achieve a net zero in balance. The yellow line here is your balance, and when you cross the x-axis, you're essentially hitting a payback period. And then, before they're able to get this paid back, they then hit a second point in time where the investments are needed for the second compliance period. And you can see that the savings increase pretty dramatically. This building is initially showing negative electric savings because they're increasing their electricity use due to electrification. And then a third investment that happens in 2038. And then, essentially we're showing these benefits all the way through to 2050. The savings, as you can see here, are not necessarily borne by this building short term. A lot of that, again, because they are a building that is in the unfortunate position of having to electrify a lot of their systems early. But long term, they are able to save a decent amount, even with the deck stacked against them somewhat, with the initial investment costs being what they are when they were.
May I interrupt?
Sure.
The graph's very small, so I can't really see. Are they cumulative savings or annual?
So the yellow line represents cumulative savings. So
thank you.
You see the yellow line drop at the beginning, and then by 2041, you're getting that net zero payback period.
May I add to that question? So this is cumulative without any interest costs, right? So the net present is not zero by year 2041. You'd have to go further.
Correct. Yes. Yeah, and this is because all of the inputs in our formula are not taking into account escalations due to inflation and cost of capital currently.
Can I ask another question, since we're broken the ice with questions? So one of the issues that I always struggle with when I see charts like this is often the investment in the infrastructure is borne by the landlord, if you will, or the owner of the building, and the savings are eventually to the tenants of the building. So how do you handle that relationship if at all, between, the owner of the building and the tenants?
Yeah, that is a definitely an important question, and one that I think the energy efficiency industry has been attempting to grapple with for many years now. Our analysis is only looking at the whole building level. We're looking at net costs and net benefits across the entire building stock. The way that tenant-landlord relationships are handled can vary depending on, obviously the specifics of situations, what can be passed through to tenants versus what cannot be passed through to tenants when it comes to either capital costs or associated savings. There is a body of work around this. It's commonly referred to as the split incentive issue, on different ways that, you can try to develop financing structures or payment structures that will appropriately define who should be bearing the costs and achieving the savings associated with a given retrofit. But that is not directly handled through this analysis, broadly speaking.
Thank you.
Josh, we've got another hand in the room.
Yeah, I guess I'm surprised. I've worked on several million square feet of commercial building space in Montgomery County over the last several years. Not a single building that I've worked on, and these are high performance buildings meeting many energy standards and emission standards. Not a single one has data on the entire building because of this landlord-tenant complexity and the fact that many of the occupants of the building have their own services. So I'm a little surprised at that. And I guess I want to take this moment to do a little detour, which is to disclose some potential conflicts of interest that I have, because many of my clients are commercial building developers, owners, and operators, and they will be affected by these. On the other hand, I'm a consultant to them, so I stand to gain by additional hoops they have to jump through, like verification of energy. I've also done consulting for BOMA, Building Owners and Managers Association. I still receive about $1,000 a year in royalties from publications, and I also serve on ICSC, Shopping Center Council, Environmental and Land Use Committee. So I just want the council to know that I have those potential conflicts.
Sure, and yeah, thank you for the question, and it is definitely a good one. I can also speak from personal past experience here. I did used to work in consulting within New York City as they passed Local ID4 and their benchmarking ordinances. Getting at tenant energy data is certainly a difficult thing. I can't necessarily speak to Montgomery County's process specifically, just because I haven't worked within it. But I do know that a lot of regions rely on cooperation with the utilities to obtain whole building energy data. So utilities will set up frameworks and programs that support aggregate data, whole building data. It's defined in a couple of different ways depending. And then, sometimes letter of authorizations to a certain percentage of tenants are needed to obtain the information. But typically speaking, benchmarking ordinances are attempting to get at that whole building energy consumption data wherever possible.
If I could continue the detour here for a moment before you get back on track, Josh. This is Chris Hogan from MDE. Just maybe one point on the split incentive problem. We'll be talking about this again later, but of course, one of the policy solutions to that is to provide funding for energy efficiency upgrades, right, which the state does currently through the Empower Maryland program and other programs. And I'll note that in the Climate Solutions Now Act, which established this requirement for this regulation that will require some of these upgrades to be installed, the General Assembly also established a task force with a specific mandate of considering what resources can be made available and should be made available to building owners to comply with this. So what additional resources the state should put behind achieving this standard. So there's the technical issues, how the modeling works and how we're going to get around the data availability. There are provisions for that in the regulation. We, of course, need the data to do the regulation, right? So we have to figure that out. To some extent, that's a text of the regulation challenge. To some extent, that's an implementation challenge and a technical guidance challenge, right? And so we're interested in advice how to navigate that. But I just wanted to make sure everyone's aware that there's policy response here to consider as well. And maybe a point of order, I see a council member has joined, Dr. Ben Hobbs. Hopefully you're here because your travel worked, not because your travel didn't work, but either way, it's good to see you, Dr. Hobbs. Sorry, Josh.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. I'm in Italy at the moment. Massively jet lagged, but fascinated by what I see, so I'm staying away.
Very good. Yeah, and thank you for the additional feedback and comments there. I think we can go to the next slide if there's no further questions here. So, as I noted previously, essentially what you saw on that screen for that one individual sample building was an analysis that was performed across all of the buildings within our model. Just so happens that the total amount of coverage or covered buildings was just under 1 billion square feet of real estate assets. And you'll see sort of in our next slide when we do a per square foot, the numbers don't change that much, mainly because that is a nice round 1 billion square feet that the analysis is being performed across. But we do have the aggregate numbers here. So essentially all of these numbers here represent the total both costs, investments, and savings associated with the 25-year period between 2025 and 2050. So you have your baseline energy costs, so business as usual, as if no interventions or investments are made in any buildings. And you have a business as usual system replacement cost. So this was a component of our electrification analysis. We wanted to make sure that the value associated with a brand new heating system or hot water system being installed within a building was taken into account appropriately. And so modeling out the business as usual replacement cost was a component of the overall analysis. Not a huge component, you can see by the total numbers there, but an important one to note. The total efficiency investments was close to $9 billion over the 25-year period. Electrification investments a little bit under $6.5 billion for a total energy cost savings from baseline of $22.3 billion. So through this model, you could see that we are showing net cost savings across all investments. I will say that, just because we're showing net costs here does not mean that every building is going to be in a good position relative to compliance and relative to the financials associated with their investments. There is a wide variation in the situations that exist for each individual building. And because of that, it is really important to make sure that incentives and support are given to buildings as appropriate to make sure that these are, strong investments that are made across the entire building stock. And then we can hop quickly to the next slide. We'll show some similar numbers on a per square foot basis. This is very much how real estate entities like to see numbers like this, because it's important to the way that things are normalized. Again, all of these numbers, even though we are doing it on a per square foot basis, unless otherwise specified, are representing the entire 25-year period. If you're paying $70 a foot on your energy use every year, you're doing something very, very wrong. It actually does come out to $2.8 per square foot over the entire time period in that baseline scenario. And these are the other associated square foot values. The only other one we do on a yearly basis here is the energy cost savings from baseline, which boil down to around $0.9 a foot per year. Another supplementary piece of analysis that we did, this was much more back of the envelope than it was a in-depth study. but working with IMT on sort of understanding what is acceptable internal rate of return values for investments that are made in individual properties. We performed this analysis across each of the buildings, across each intervention that was happening. So essentially for each compliance period, you have a decision point where a building needs to invest or not invest. 45% of all of the interventions, according to the IRR thresholds that we use, they're rough assumptions that were developed in cooperation between LBL and IMT and the MDE team. 45% of those are commercially financeable today, including 65% within that first compliance period. Everything that we're doing within this analysis is relative to existing technologies. So, advancements in energy efficiency technology and electrification technology should make the picture even better in the future. We're certainly hopeful of. But it is good to know that, a decent number of these investments are, within the realm of being reasonable for financing purposes on a commercial basis.
Do we have a question?
Yeah, Josh, it's Larry Schoen again. So I'm surprised at the relatively low cost of the efficiency investments. And so my question is about where the data comes from and how you are validating it.
Sure. So the efficiency investment data we take directly from these cost curves that were developed in cooperation with PNNL in their process. And we do have some slides in the appendix if we wanted to hop down there to show a little bit more detail on that. If we did, it would be, I believe it's slide 49 where these start. But just to describe it as a starting point, they essentially take prototype buildings for the major property types that we're looking at and build ECM lists, similar to what you would do during an energy audit. So you have low-hanging fruit type measures, things like retrocommissioning of buildings, all the way through to high cost, high savings measures like envelope upgrades, window upgrades, things like that. And they put all of these into a table prioritized by the overall cost per savings to develop a cost curve that we then apply to each building. So again, the net effect of that curve is that the initial investments in the building are relatively low cost, and then deeper investments into the building to get deeper savings cost more and more. So we're showing this average value of $9 a square foot of efficiency investments. It does vary a lot building to building. Some buildings are looking at well over $20 a foot. Others looking at much lower if they're already in a relatively good position from an EUI standpoint and from a direct emissions standpoint. So that was the overall methodology used.
So you've told me that people go out to prototype buildings and figure out ECMs, but you haven't told me how they get the implementation cost and how that cost is validated.
Yeah, so the dollar per square foot associated with each of those energy conservation measures comes from a variety of different sources that PNNL used. There was a literature review that was done as part of this, so looking at studies. I know that the Montgomery County Stephen Winter Associates study was utilized as one of those sources. Also, technical studies and reviews that were done of the DC BEPS ordinance were taken into account and looked at as part of the process. And then a lot of theirs also comes from their work within energy code cost effectiveness reviews that they do on a annualized basis. So renovations of buildings and associated costs associated with those ECMs. Everything is done very much on a broad standpoint, given the lack of information we have on specific systems within buildings and such. So that does lead to uncertainty within the analysis for sure. But they, did their best to make sure that their review was exhaustive of all available literature when it came to the associated costs with each ECM.
I have a question. I can't see how to raise my hand. I'm sorry. This is Ben Hobbs. Can I ask it? Yeah. And just a quick preface. I realize, of course, that the purpose of the legislation is to lower emissions as well as to save money for consumers. So my focus on benefit cost analysis doesn't mean that I'm not aware of the great many other benefits to this program. But I wanted to know, Josh, what is the interest rate that you use as the cutoff for the internal rate of return analysis? And then I have a follow-on based on that.
Yeah, I can see if I can pull them up. Essentially, thresholds were established by property type. So there was no single threshold that was set, but it was based around the general market today. So, office buildings had, for example, a much lower or a much more stringent threshold than, let's say, multifamily buildings, just because of the state of the market between those property types. But I can get you the specific thresholds that we use. High level
long-term interest rates used in benefit cost analysis, of course, have a big impact on this sort of study. Definitely be interested in those. What I was going to ask is that if we used a reasonable rate of interest, for example, the federal government often uses 5% real rate of return for water resources investments, or used to, would the present worth be positive, or would it be negative? I suspect with the heavy upfront costs that on the whole financially it would be negative, but of course that doesn't include emissions benefits. Have you calculated any net present worth figures, as well as the net cost savings over 25 years, which are positive, but on a present worth basis may be unfortunately really negative?
So I can't speak to that specifically because we did not calculate it as part of this this analysis, but agreed that it would be, something that would be good to look at as part of the process. We would, again, want to make sure that we're using cap rates appropriate to each property type within the Maryland region as the starting point for those calculations. And yeah, I think to answer your initial question, thank you, Cliff, the IRR thresholds did range from 5 to 20% based off of the property type. So 20% for the higher end ones, and then 5% for the lower end on thresholds.
Okay, thanks. It'll be interesting to see that. And of course, I don't know what we're going to be seeing in terms of estimates of emissions impacts of what looks like a reduction in about 1/3 in energy uses. And of course, that's really important and what we're very much focused on. But it would be good to also know the what it looks like financially. Thank you.
Yep, great question, great feedback. Thank you. Other questions or thoughts of this? I believe that this is the end of my slides here. Just checking my deck. If you hop to the next one. If people do have further questions on this, LBL and PNNL would be more than happy to support any questions that may come up. So my email address, and then Andrea Mangual from the PNNL team, who's been my partner in crime in delivering this analysis. Please feel free to reach out to either or both of us. I will also note that we do have supplemental slides and analysis caveats that are beginning on slide 39 of this. Again, due to limited time, I'm not going to walk through each of those caveats, but there are we do have them itemized and listed out there for public review. So please take a look at those as well, and appreciate the time.
Hey, Joshua, it's a different Ben. did your analysis include, I didn't see a graph on it, but did your analysis include there's an alternate compliance pathway where you just pay the social cost of carbon of your site generated carbon? And I did some sample math on that for, like I ballparked 100,000 square foot building with an EUI of 35 and a third of it's gas. And I came up with, it's a real hand wave, but I came up with like $20,000 a year that you're paying, which isn't a whole lot of energy efficiency upgrade. Did your analysis go into that at all?
Yes, and a good question. I should have mentioned this earlier. We did, when we did the initial iteration of this analysis, exclude alternative compliance payments as part of the analysis. But in the iteration that led to these numbers, we are taking into account alternative compliance payments at an individual building level. So essentially, the building is making its decision based off of what makes more sense financially over the entire compliance period. So every time it has that opportunity to either comply or just pay the alternative compliance payment. If the alternative compliance payment is a lower cost overall, they're going to go with that option. So that is something we are taking into account here.
Got it. Thank you.
Gosh, thank you very much for providing this overview of the analysis that the lab has done for MDE and the development of this regulation. The Berkeley lab has been a tremendous technical assistance partner throughout the last year or so that we've been working on this. So thanks to you and your team for your efforts, and by extension, thanks to the U.S. Department of Energy for funding this, the ability to provide the assistance that you provided.
Yeah, shout out to the EPA as well. They were a big part of our baseline analysis as well, as you're well aware. But sure. Thank you all, appreciate it.
Thank you, Josh. So let's see, next slide. I have just a couple more slides as a wrap up, and then we'll open for any questions, comments, discussion that the council has. So on average, just to quickly summarize a couple of key points. We see that over the 2025 to 2050 time horizon, covered buildings save an average of about $4.50 per square foot. That equates to about $4.5 billion in savings to the building owners over that time period, building owners and tenants. Although, as I think Dr. Hobbs pointed out, what's not included in that are all of the air quality and emissions benefits, the social cost benefits, many billions of dollars more of additional benefits to society from this regulation. Of course, we anticipate that funding from the federal government and state programs will be able to help the building owners to come into compliance, cover some of those upfront capital costs that they'd experience. And as we mentioned earlier, MDE and MEA are right now running a building energy transition implementation task force to develop the recommendations on the additional state funding that should be provided to help building owners come into compliance with these standards. Next slide. So our roadmap ahead, we are planning next year, once we staff up on VEPS, to be able to offer a lot more informational sessions for the entities that will be impacted by VEPS. There's a lot of information that we need to get out, more information about what does benchmarking and reporting actually look like? What's the process for third-party verification? And are there additional credentials that we should accept for third-party verification? Information about electric and gas company reporting requirements, so on and so forth. There's a lot of information, again, about 9,000 covered buildings, so a lot of outreach and education planned as we look down the road here. We will be updating our technical guidance to reflect the additional clarifications that we learned from our stakeholders are needed in the technical guidance. So it's a continuous development process, really.
Hi, Jeannie.
Oh, yep.
Vaccination clinic. What is this?
Who's speaking?
The one at the Blairs. Sorry, I'm in the middle of listening to a call too, but I wanted to pick up your call. I saw you called before.
Can you check your mute button, please?
Yeah, sorry.
Everyone check your mute.
Getting some It sounds like the caller may be muted. Thank you. So just as a final wrap up here, the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022 requires MDE to develop BEPS regulations that cover most large buildings in the state with net direct emissions and standards. Decarbonizing buildings is an important part of achieving the state's goals. The proposed regulations incorporate key stakeholder concerns, and we conducted robust stakeholder outreach and engagement to develop these regulations. At this point, I want to introduce a colleague of mine, Allison Jaden, who is for the last 8 months doing a lot of the deep dives, working with stakeholders and our technical consultants to develop the technical guidance. At this point, I'd say that Allison is much more of an expert on the nitty-gritty details of this regulation than I am. So Allison and I will be happy to take any questions and comments the council may have.
Thank you. A reminder, we're going to have a discussion among the council first, and then we'll reach out more broadly. And we have 14 people have signed up to speak. So let's proceed orderly just to make sure we use our time efficiently. So opening up to the council for further questions of the presenters. Ross.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to limit it to one. Put a restriction on myself. So I appreciate that there's a detailed table here that lists, different building types. And although Mark didn't highlight it at the beginning, restaurants are exempt. And that leads to my question. So if you have a shopping center, we can think of many, like the one in Columbia, and it has all these restaurants, and then you have all this other stuff. And some of the other stuff inside the shopping center might be, I could find one, something with a very low and something with a very high. Yet the only data you can get because of when it was constructed is kind of for the whole shopping center.
Yep.
How do you deal with that?
So if that food service
Can I make a plug
facility.
first?
Oh, please.
In your packets, you guys also have a copy of our technical guidance, which does have some of the and Mark can give a high level overview, but you can kind of see we've tried to outline some of those things in the technical manual themselves. But go ahead with that.
Thanks, Alice. So first of all, the law requires that food service facilities, and those are facilities that meet a certain definition that's already in COMAR for food service facilities, are exempt. So in the case that you have a food service facility in a covered building, it's a great point that you brought, a mall with, lots of food service happening. If those entities are individually metered, and we don't know how common that is, but if they're individually metered, then of course that individually metered data for the food service facility can be backed out. We assume though that a number of food service facilities are not individually metered. So we worked with the labs to create standard deductions based on what we know of the energy intensity and emissions of food service facilities. So we provided a an electricity reduction per square foot and a direct emissions reduction per square foot standard deduction, if you will, so that all the building owner needs to know is how many square feet of space do I have in food service, and they can use those standard deductions, or again, if they're separately metered, they can just negate those meters from the report.
Thank you.
And I do think one other thing I would add to that we do have in the technical manual as well is that given the square foot of the different activities that might be going on in a covered building, there would be a blended standard for that building based on what is inside the building. And so we do have that outlined as well in the manual.
Ross, if I was leaving a pause there, if you have other questions, this is right. If you have a bunch of questions,
monopolize.
Well, I'll take a turn so you can. We can
Yeah.
monopolize.
Yes.
But if there's somebody else, so just as a reality check, I looked back at a project I did in 2017, a 70,000 square foot building, educational building in Baltimore City. Did not have an air conditioning system, so we put a whole new system in it. which is what some of these buildings are going to have to do to meet the target, put a whole new system in. The cost was $2.5 million for a 70,000 square foot building. That's over $35 a square foot.
Mhm.
So that kind of reinforces that the numbers for, I mean, I'm in favor of building performance. I serve on as vice chair of AQCAC Standard 189 high performance green buildings. I'm a proponent of this in general. I'm just very concerned that the implementation numbers, one of my concerns, implementation numbers are way, way, way off by an order of magnitude, not just by a few bucks and not by uncertainty.
Well, one thing to note about those statewide numbers, that, you know, what the lab did was they took the total of, we have about 1 billion square feet of covered building space, and they looked at what's the total capital cost divided by the total of 1 billion square feet of space. Remember that about 1/3 of buildings already achieve the emission standards. Another third of buildings already achieve the EUI standards. So those billions or millions of square feet, although accounted for in the total amount of 1 billion square feet, would have no contribution toward the capital cost, or little contribution toward the capital cost figure. So in other words, you know, when we look at that statewide analysis, you should not draw a conclusion that the statewide analysis has any specific representation on an individual building level. Every building is going to have to determine where am I now? What is the standard? What are the improvements, if any, that need to be achieved?
If I might, so Larry, would you say that's a typical building, or there's no way you can classify it like that?
I just want to, I'll characterize it. It's an old building, historic building, one you would not want to tear down. There's a lot of carbon impact from tearing a building down and redoing it. This didn't even involve any envelope improvements. That was a separate project. I can't say, it's probably typical of an older building.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe if I could add, historic buildings are exempt. Also, schools are exempt.
Yeah.
So if this was historic, said it was educational.
Colleges are exempt?
What's the scope of the school exemption?
K through 12, so 12.
K through 12.
So this was
In any case,
college.
yeah, in any case, historic buildings are exempt. So, and you
When I
would
say
expect those
historic, I
to.
don't know if that's an official designation as historic.
Gotcha.
It's one of the old, it's an old industrial building.
Yeah, we're not holding you to. I just want to
Yeah.
know. Megan, I didn't see your thing up. I apologize.
Okay, I don't know if we do that here or not.
We do it any way you want.
If I could add maybe one thing we can do in the TSD, why don't we provide more ranges of the per square foot costs we saw in the analysis, right? Because this slide just had the total. I mean, it had the total capital cost for the entire stock. So projects like that would be included. But maybe we should include more about not just the overall per square foot, but the range we saw in the model. That could be helpful. And sorry, Dr. Latcha.
So I've talked to a couple people who know more about this than I do. So if you need more than what I have, sorry. But my understanding is that Boston and New York City did something similar, and that they used emissions intensity instead of energy use intensity. And I'm wondering if you guys considered that, and why you decided to go the way you went.
So we have a target system, right? So this is consistent with EPA guidance. It's also consistent with the requirements under the Climate Solutions Now Act, that we have emissions intensity, if you will, and total energy intensity. Other jurisdictions, some jurisdictions have just like the very widely reported local law 97 New York City, they have just an emissions intensity target, if I remember correctly, and I'm not an expert on local law 97.
I think they have both a net zero type requirement. So for New York City, it's 80% by 2050. And they have an emissions intensity standard per building type.
So our direct emissions standards are roughly the equivalent of emissions intensity. Some jurisdictions have set just EUI targets. Some jurisdictions have set just emissions targets, emissions intensity targets. And what the EPA has recommended, and as we saw in the Climate Solutions Now Act, is the recommendation now is that a jurisdiction set the two-target system to focus on both direct emissions and EUI.
But if a building is fully electric and they're buying their power from a renewable source, they would meet an emissions standard, but they might not meet an energy use standard.
That's correct.
So it does make a difference. Because New York and Boston chose the emissions standard as the approach as opposed to the energy use.
Oh, yeah, I'm not saying that there's no difference. I'm just saying that we have a two-target system as required by law, and those targets work in tandem, but they achieve slightly different ends.
So I think they both have two targets as well. They have the net zero target, and then they have the emissions intensity target.
Okay.
Instead of an energy use target as their second target. Just something to consider.
We develop the regulations as required by law.
So in view of this emissions unit intensity standards, we going to have any kind of a similar like standards to power plant force generating units. So if they can meet this, then like she said, anyone who use electricity like just a whole like for the building, then they could just hit with it. Like you don't have to worry about like getting high like value of EUI to the building, right? So is it something
Right.
that working together right now?
Yeah, so all of the emissions associated with the electricity that a building is consumed is not included in this. We, of course, have other policies that work to reduce emissions from the electricity sector. So when we look at the effect of all of our policies together, that's where we see, of course, the decarbonization, reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the entire economy.
So, I'll come back because I don't see anybody in the room. Oh, did you have your hand up?
Do you want to speak, Mr. Noga? Or no?
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure if this was covered. I had my hand up for an energy use intensity question. The basic question is, we got the letter from Mr. Powell on behalf of the Building Industry Association. I'm curious about staff's response to that, which I think I heard some of it in this answer, but I think we're also being asked not to act on that part as part of our action today. And I'm curious about staff's response to that.
Again, the law requires that in this regulation, we set a two-target system. One is to set targets around net direct emissions reductions, and the other is to set targets for energy use intensity. So it's a requirement in the law. Also important to note that the General Assembly changed the name of this program. This was first contemplated to be a building emissions standard. They changed the name of this to Building Energy Performance Standards when they added the requirement that we include EUI standards in this regulation.
Thank you.
Good question. Thank you. Any other else, Mr. Noga? You done? All right. Ross, go ahead.
So I just want to begin with a smile and thank Mark and Allison for a great job. And, when I ask you these questions, it's not to belie the great job you did, but I do have a few suggestions for the next period that will be after this. And one is, going off of what Ben Hobbs said and Larry said, it would be really great to have the assumptions, including interest rate and cost of capital and, net present value clearly laid out when you go forward. Not, oh, we'll have to get that to you, but because you're going to be asked those questions. And secondly, again, I'm not trying to be a jerk, but, in the academics, when we do this, we really want to see uncertainty, because having a single number is just not believable. And so having an uncertainty range, including maybe, it will be not of net economic benefit for the bottom line of paying for electricity, but the social benefit of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and associated pollutants, those benefits are enormous. And so, having uncertainty on the financials will really help. Okay, then the other thing is, I'm not going to belabor this too much, but looking through your great tables, I see something that's striking. Laboratory has 5.35 interim standard for 2030, 2034. Laboratory is a very broad word. And then if I flip over, I see other dash technology science 0.001, and I'm not making this up. That's tiny. So am I a laboratory? Oh, yes, I am. Like nobody's going to claim they're other technological science if they can be a lab. It's just, I mean, because they have, you know, so I don't know how you can finesse these numbers and try to deal with, you know, people are, how do you judge what they are, and can you make these more copacetic, more consistent?
We are very fortunate to have detailed guidance from the US EPA on what the property types are. And it's a very important beginning part of benchmarking to correctly identify your property type. There's also a requirement for a third-party verification. So once every 5 years, we set what we consider kind of the minimum standard on the period for verification, which is one of the many ways that we provided flexibility to the owners of covered buildings for this, that we that verification needs to also include verification that the person is reporting the correct property type.
So what does laboratory mean? If you don't,
I have not committed the EPA's guidance to memory. I don't
sure.
The EPA, so the Energy Star Portfolio Manager program is very robust online with a lot of detailed guidance what is included in each property type, as well as a really well-managed help desk that can guide people into what they might be. So we really wanted to make sure to be leveraging all the great work of EPA behind this program that so many people are already using, and not put in any, you know, competing guidance about what would be included in each type.
Okay, so this is my last, I'm going to muzzle myself. So I've been at this for a long time, and I know y'all are fairly new to it. So part of what I view my role here has always been is, does it pass the sniff test? And having a 3 order of magnitude plus 3.5 order of magnitude difference between the emissions of a lab and other science technology does not pass the sniff test, regardless of what the EPA says.
And this is one of the reasons why we're really emphasizing that the standards will be recalculated in 2026 at the earliest, when we have the actual 2025, because what we will need is eventually for any buildings that meet that other technical building, whichever property type you just listed, if we have a significant number of them and they say that this is their property type, this is their energy use, then a standard will be set based on the median of that specific property type.
Awesome.
And maybe to follow up on, there was really good input on additional analytical information to include in the TSD. So we've written all that down and we'll see what we can fit in the scope for additional scenarios.
Council members, any additional questions?
I mean, the broad question that I put in an email earlier was, there seemed to be a lot of comments, and then the list of changes that were made in response to the comments was pretty narrow. I'm involved in processes for standards writing, and you often have a table of the comments and what change was made to the reg. And I asked for if you had such a table, and so I'm asking again, is there?
Yeah, so we provided, I think, a very high level summary of the changes, the number of actual edits that occurred, and more, I'd say more significantly, the information that we gained from the comments that informed the technical support documents and the technical manual was significant. So I don't know if Allison, you want to build on that.
Yeah, we don't have like a formal response to comment in the same way we will when it's the public comment period, when the regulation is formally proposed after this council's meeting. But I mean, the summary list that was shared on the slide here, and I think was an email about adding the affordable housing definition and the entirety of the opportunity for that exemption, the detailed rewrite and clarification of the electric and gas companies' reporting requirements, refinement and improvements to many of the definitions, which I think a lot of the comments we received were on concerns and clarifications to the definitions that were underlying the regulation, and then the improvements to the performance standards. Even though that's a short list, it was pretty robust, the amount of improvements that we made. And we were really writing and assembling the technical guidance that we've shared with you simultaneously. So there's not really a tracked improvement because we co-developed the guidance based on the types of questions we were receiving and the comments we were receiving from those comments. I don't have a table to share at this point, but it really, I think, made the regulation much stronger from what we've heard.
No, I get that it could be hard to, an individual comment, and here was the actual individual change in language, but it's on a broad sense. So for instance, one of my questions was, how were and I don't want an answer to this particular question now, I'm just saying this is an example of something that could go in a table that could inform us better. How were Baltimore County comments addressed about parks and fields, food service, laundry, and generators? I mean, a sort of a narrative description. We saw this comment. We made changes to thus and such to respond to it. That kind of table would be really useful to understand the stakeholder input and our response to it. This is a complex, I mean, as you know, it's a complex and very far-reaching regulation. So no attempt to do that sort of thing?
Well, so again, that'll be part of the formal proposal process. I do know that that was one of the comments that informed our change of the definition, making owners not responsible for the property, but the building, for example. But so we of course will have the formal response to comments when we propose. And then with 9,000 plus buildings, there are going to be so many special cases, right? And we can anticipate some of them now, and so we tried to build in some of that, but we're not going to be able to anticipate all of them in this reg. And so that's why we have this continuing process to flesh out the technical guidance, to engage with the building owners, to see how much issue spotting we can do between now and 2025, and how much we can address just through implementation, right? And then any items we can't address through implementation that may necessitate a reg amendment, of course, we are opening up the standards for the true up in 2026. And so we'll have fodder for that. But yeah, just realistically, we're not going to be able to anticipate every single issue right now.
It just made me realize how much of an effort to compliance and enforcement is.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I hope you got a big budget for that.
So we don't, but thank you for the sentiment.
You trying to raise your hand, Nicole?
Yeah, I really just wanted to dive in or just add that I appreciate this conversation. I wanted to flag, I saw in the comments as well, and I know that you probably haven't had a chance to formally address them, but for the comments of the suggestions you got regarding the definitions of agricultural buildings, I saw that there were suggestions about adding housing, houses that house animals and livestock, as opposed to just structures for purposes of crop, and also structures that are used for the storage and distribution of agricultural items. I think those are things you need to take into consideration. Actually, if I have a chance here, just while I have my moment, I also saw in the technical guidance that non-covered structures and buildings are going to have to apply for that exemption. Have you worked out that process? Are they to expect? I know there's a form they submit, but then what happens after that? Will they expect a confirmation? Will they know when their form was submitted, and they'll get a date, time-stamped confirmation, and then get an approval, or how is that going to work?
A great question. I'd say that's among the implementation details that we still need to map out.
Gotcha.
Thank you. And any final questions from the council?
Yes, I'm still not.
I have one.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, so it's a general question and then a question for a response to a specific proposal. So the letters that we have received, and I'm certainly not a lawyer, and I'm not going to address any of the legal points. That's for judge to decide. But there's the point made that there are alternative compliance payments for exceeding the emissions limits, that the alternative compliance payments seem roughly based on the Biden administration values of $180 or so a ton for the social cost of carbon. Very reasonable, way above the RGGI levels, but that's where we need to go, I think. But there are no alternative compliance payments for energy use intensity, and I'm wondering whether any were considered. And then I have a little an idea that I would like a reaction to. So were any alternative compliance payments considered for EUI, which seems to be something that at least the folks who wrote in were concerned about?
Sure.
Yeah. Oh, Mark, can I take that one? So the legislature specifically authorized an alternative compliance fee for excess tons of GHGs. The legislature did not authorize an alternative compliance fees for EUI overages. And so when there isn't a specific statutory authorization for an alternative fee or payment, we don't have the authority to create one via regulation. And so in cases where the legislature doesn't specify an alternate compliance approach like a fee, it's simply our existing enforcement authority that's at play.
So what would happen to a building that doesn't meet the EUI?
It would be like any other regulatory violation or our existing authority.
Follow that logic train a little bit.
Sure. So it would be the same, for example, for any other element of violation that's not a tonnage overage, like, for example, failure to benchmark and report. Those are all standard regulatory violations. The department has existing authority and processes laid out in Title II, Subtitle 6, I believe, that we have to follow for any regulatory violation. That's a process. We cannot presuppose the outcome of that process by putting fixed outcomes in the reg. So that's why we legally wouldn't be able to just put in an alternative compliance fee for EUI. So instead, it would be a compliance conversation just like any other regulated entity failing to meet a regulatory requirement.
Still not. So to follow the example of my 70,000 square foot building that recently put in a new HVAC system, and it's not going to meet the targets for EUI without significant investment. What if they don't do it?
So presumably then we would get data from that year showing that they were over their EUI targets, right? So then we would engage with them and say, you missed your EUI targets. Let's talk about corrective action. Penalties are always on the table for regulatory violations. And we have processes we have to follow for administrative penalties or civil penalties for a particularly large violation that goes to court. Again, we have to follow that process on a case-by-case basis under the law.
Okay, so I will just say that I consider the ideas of having to bring people to court and the work this would mean for MDE, and I have no idea what the potential civil penalties spoken about in the Gordon Feinblatt letter of 25K a day or 2.5K a day or anywhere within reason, but there does seem to be a very reasonable penalty, and the legislature in its wisdom didn't consider that. But if you're a 100 kW system, you use, let's say, a couple megawatts a day, we know what the PJM calculates the marginal emissions rates. Let's say it's a half ton per megawatt hour. So that's 2 megawatt hours a day times 0.5 times then whatever the penalty is. That sounds like a couple $100 a day. Could be a lot more. Of course, buildings can use a lot more than a couple megawatt hours a day, but that's also funds that could be used to help support some of the programs that are going to be developed to improve building envelopes and help out renters and so forth. It seems to be crazy to leave this to a very rigid, and you may not be able to do anything about it, but to leave it to a very rigid legal process, you're either in compliance or you're not, when there's definitely a basis that would be consistent with the emissions alternative compliance that would make sense and generate badly needed funds for the sorts of programs we're talking about for improving energy efficiency. So I guess that's not a question, that's an opinion. But I would be definitely interested in the reaction, whether that's that's something that could be proposed in the future if indeed this is implemented, and then we see that all these that a lot of buildings using resistance heating presently and can't afford to switch wind up being in non-compliance, and then placing MDE in a position of having to enforce this if at that point it would be possible or desirable to propose the legislature to modify things and provide a reasonable alternative compliance payment, which would also generate these resources. I guess I'd like a reaction, and that's not a question.
I could give one, and I won't react on what the legislature will do specifically. But you mentioned, the impacts of excess pollution resulting from violations and the costs facing violators. I'll note that when we're pursuing administrative penalties, we are required by law to consider the environmental harm from the excess pollution. So that's definitely conceptually included in our requirements, as well as economic and technological feasibility. There are a series of considerations that we have to include when we're in our enforcement authority. And so some of them mapped conceptually to some of the issues you brought up, Dr. Hobbs. So the process, while it may sound very rigid, it does account for, and we are required to account for some of the things you mentioned.
Would it be fair to say that the evaluation process of any penalty could include a calculation that might relate to the processes that Ben suggested?
Yeah, we are required to consider the environmental harms resulting from pollution, as well as technological and economic feasibility.
So that's already in place then.
Extremely interesting, and I think I hear that you can't say at a point like this whether how such calculations might work out or what sort of policy MDE might adopt in that case, but that's within the realm of possibility, it appears. If I follow John's line of thought.
I think so. I mean, certainly on a case-by-case basis, we're required to consider these things. I can't say for sure whether there could be a preemptive policy or not. I don't know. That would be a separate legal question.
It would be a huge headache. It'd be better to have a blanket policy ahead of time, but I realize you're not in a position to do that. Okay, I've gone on probably long enough on that, unless somebody else has a reaction to this issue.
Larry?
Not that issue in particular, but I'm still struggling with net zero direct GHG, greenhouse gas. If I convert a building to all electric, and so therefore I have no on-site emissions, have I met that or not?
That's right. So the easiest way to think of what is, and I apologize, you asked this during the presentation, I didn't drill into this, so sorry for that oversight. The easiest way to think of what is net direct greenhouse gas emissions, it's essentially direct greenhouse gas emissions, which are emissions that occur on site from the building, almost exclusively from the combustion of fossil fuels in those buildings, right? So that's direct emissions. The additional component there, the law required us to define net direct and to keep various things in consideration in that definition. So what we've done is developed a definition that in the rare cases where we have buildings that are also on district energy systems, and if there are emissions associated with the thermal inputs that building is receiving from that district energy system, then the fraction of that emissions that are associated with the steam or chilled water imports to the building are also included in the building's direct emissions calculations. So that's, net direct emissions is only something different from direct emissions in the cases of the buildings that are on district energy systems.
So I haven't kept up with the cogeneration system at downtown Baltimore, but assuming that still exists, so that contribute to a particular building.
Yep.
And then one sort of related question. So, EUI, I see it says site EUI, so I can't buy RECs, renewable energy credits, to meet that criterion. Is that
correct?
That's correct. But also REX, even if we were talking about source EUI, REX wouldn't really factor in, right? Like EUI is just a measure of the energy consumed, regardless of any green attributes or the emissions associated with it. It's just what is on a kBTU per thousand of British thermal unit basis, how much energy is a building using, right? So we narrowed that down to site based on stakeholder input. The majority of stakeholders said, don't factor in all of the energy associated with electricity generation and T&D losses. Just, measure me based on the actual energy that is used in this building. That is the site EUI measure. It's a measure of the total energy used in a building from electricity, from fuel use, site EUI.
So if I have enough solar renewable on my property to offset all my use on an annual basis, does that mean I have?
So the on-site renewable, we are fully in support of, and that would reduce the carbon intensity perhaps of your electricity supply. But again, the emissions associated with your electricity supply do not factor into this regulation at all. So the use of renewable energy on-site or off-site does not change the amount of energy that the building is using. So there's no crediting for on-site renewable in this, because at the end of the day, you're still using the same amount of electricity to run your systems, turn on the lights, yada, yada.
I just
Please.
want to make a comment. When you're talking about EUI, you're talking about energy used.
Mhm.
And it goes back to a question came up very early. How do you manage when you have different tenants with different energy use, and that's going to be reflected on the whole building? So this is going to create a problem between the tenant and the proprietor or the landlord. But then all this seems to me, it's incentive to make people have only solar electricity or different alternative electricity, or to have electrical building basically.
Mhm.
So the energy use intensity is not anymore significant if everybody has electricity using for generating, because electricity is not going to produce any, emission.
Yeah, and so this is I'm really glad that you brought this up, because the development of the EUI standards was based on the idea of efficient electrification. So one of the things that we were very careful about was not setting EUI standards that would encourage a building to put in electric resistance heaters, right? Electric resistance is a very expensive way of heating. Instead, the EUI standards are designed around more efficient systems, heat pump systems, so that the EUI targets are guiding buildings to install higher efficiency electric systems. Those systems today are cost effective. Those systems over the future, as Lawrence Berkeley National Lab pointed out, are projected to decrease utility costs at an increasing rate, because what we see is that natural gas rates are projected to increase faster than electric rates. So the efficient electrification is a very important piece of the objectives of BEPS.
And I would add in on the first part of your questions about the underlying data to make sure that we're able to move forward with the implementation of this regulation was something that we have spent a lot of time thinking about and working very closely with our colleagues at the EPA to align with the EPA's newly released guidelines for utilities on how to provide whole building aggregated data to support building owners in this. So I did mention that was an area where we, I think, did some significant improvements in the draft regulation around the requirements for electric and gas companies, assisting with providing that essential data that aligns with the EPA's best practices. And we've been talking very closely with other jurisdictions that have been walking through this process to make sure that we have, the building owners and then the department have the data we need, and it includes the entire building. And so a big piece of that is the contributions that the electric and gas companies will provide to make sure that the data are there.
No, if I might, before we go much further, we want to have an opportunity to vote today. It's 11:15. We have 15 speakers. I just want the council to be aware of this and just poll you informally. Is it okay to go a little over to make sure we hear everything we need to hear? Is there anyone that has to leave at 11:30? On the phone, are there people? So do you want to set it now that we'll stop this discussion at it's 11:15 and stop at 11:25 and then move to public comment and then wrap up by noon? Is that a good plan? Anybody disagree or alternative?
I think it's very ambitious to wrap up by noon. It'd be great if we could.
Well, we have 15 speakers. We were going to allow 2 minutes a speaker, and that would enable that. But if you think it can't be done, you want me to?
Good to have a wrap up time that we really stick to.
Yeah, all right. So what would you suggest for a wrap up time?
30,
Sorry with me. What do we think about 12:30?
but like truly hard.
Okay, truly hard, 12:30 on the phone. That good? Council members?
I have to leave at 12.
At 12:30?
12.
At 12.
That's why I'm putting it out there. So we
Yeah, I
don't.
gotta leave too.
You have to go too, Tom?
I could buy a couple minutes, but not too many after 12. That's Wes.
Oh.
And Tom.
Okay, so if we're gonna do noon,
Because we need 8.
This is Tom's.
if we're gonna do noon, then we should just go immediately to public.
Does that work?
I have more confidence. I can send
Yes.
solar hot water in restaurants. That's low hanging fruit.
A restaurant.
So it doesn't look like it's going to work to be 12:30 because we need 8. So I have,
Yeah, so John, if we do noon, I suggest we go straight to the public now.
all right, but so if it's very important that council member has a question, please go. So right now, if not, go ahead.
So I understand the final standards for the net direct emission should be 0, but is there any potential opportunity that we can rework on these EUI standards? Is that final, but like, later, like while we are looking at these interim standards to be evaluated, is there any possibility that we might reevaluate these EUI standards later? Or
So, I mean, and maybe this should have been included in the presentation. The law requires MDE to adopt a final regulation by June 1st of 2023. We apologize for being a little late on this. It's going to be 2024 before a final regulation is adopted. Because of the very tight regulatory development timeline that the General Assembly provided, we needed to use a methodology to set UI standards that was off the shelf, right? So we used what is really one of the most common methodologies for setting UI standards other jurisdictions are using. And very importantly, it's also the methodology that Montgomery County for years had stakeholder processes with building owners in Maryland to review, vet, help develop standards for Montgomery County that were based on that methodology. So, I think that we used the best methodology that we could given the time that we had for it.
All right. We've mentioned we're going to recalibrate in 2026 with actual 2025 data. And then I think maybe you were asking about like maybe in the 2030s, seeing how things go. Would there be an opportunity for you? And I think, yeah, certainly I don't want to speak for John's successor 10 years from now, but regulations are regularly amended. Yeah.
I'm going to jump right to public comment. We have 15 speakers, 2 minutes. I'll put a timer on. I'll advise you when you have a half minute left, and we got to stick to it, okay? First, I have Reverend Catherine Manhart. Please.
Sure. Hi, I'm the Reverend Catherine Manhart from St. James Episcopal Church in Potomac, Maryland. And I'm also here today with Action in Montgomery, a People's Power organization that's working on issues of equity and justice and has been for more than 20 years. We have worked to win over $1 billion for affordable housing, quality after-school programs that have served thousands of students, access to dental care, the Maryland Dream Act, and many other issues. And we are here today because burning fossil fuels in our homes and buildings is a major driver of climate emissions. This is particularly true of burning methane or natural gas in our stoves, hot water heaters, and furnaces. We are supportive of strong BEPS standards in Maryland because the solution is electrifying our homes and buildings. This includes induction stoves, heat pumps, and hot water heaters, which will remove fossil fuels that are damaging for the environment and unhealthy and dangerous for residents. In addition to supporting BEPS, we are also working hard to expand clean sources of electricity from utilities, including wind, solar, geothermal, and more. The current BEPS proposal goes a long way toward making sure we can move away from toxic and dirty methane and fossil fuels and towards a green and electric future that will be good for all of Maryland's residents.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Sheila Khan.
Hi, everyone. Hello, I'm Sheila Khan. I'm the co-chair of BATH, People Active Together in Howard. We are multiracial and multi-faith organizations of thousands of residents who have been working on environmental issues for over a decade. We are here today to ensure that we have a healthy future for ourselves and the generations to come. In Maryland, we have the opportunity to create a healthy and sustainable future for all of our residents. Many of the members of our congregations have experienced the negative effects of bad environmental policies in the past and have suffered the health consequences, including respiratory illness. Additionally, buildings make up 20% of greenhouse gas emission in Maryland. Gas appliances and stoves create unhealthy living environments, particularly for the children and elderly. We encourage Maryland to be at the forefront of building regulations and legislations that will move us off the toxic natural gas and to more sustainable and safe energy sources for everyone. We strongly support regulations for buildings to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to make healthier living conditions for all Maryland residents. We are here today to support the new BEPS regulations and to support closing loopholes, particularly one that leave out about apartment residents. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thanks for your brevity and your great comments. Next up, we have Sergine Yango. Did I say it right?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello again. I am Sergine Yango with Action in Montgomery. I am a resident of Silver Spring, and I am raising 3 children in our public schools. I started organizing with aim at other parents to win quality after-school programs at Burmese Elementary School, and the program is now in 14 schools. We also filed to win new schools buildings for our school and South Lake Elementary School. 2 titles are schools that were being left behind in our county. I am here today because I have spent the summer taking 200 of residents in rental apartments in Silver Spring. We have been building relationship with them and measuring NO2 level in the apartment when they use their gas stove. Gas is dangerous. Many apartments we have measured have NO2 that are more than 2 times level the EPA say is safe for outdoor air quality. NO2 has been shown to cause asthma, respiratory illness, and affect brain development in children. And I want to say something that the health cause of asthma, cancer, plus other illness from methane should also be considered. Residents have also told us of time when they have accidentally left their stove on and gas has filled the apartment. This is human error, but there's no way to eliminate all human errors. There have been several gas explosions and fire in our community that have caused permanent injury, death, and long-time suffering. We need strong BEPS regulation to make sure people like me and my neighbors can be healthy and safe. We also want to make sure that all people living in garden style apartment are included in this regulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Jose Coronado.
Hello.
Hi.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jose Coronado. I'm coming from CASA as a climate policy analyst. We're the largest immigrant advocacy organization in the state of Maryland, and we've been working on climate solutions. Now we were there when it was proposed legislation, when it was being heard in the committee, and when it finally passed. We're here now during its implementation. I want to bring up a couple of points. The first one being the compliance of property owners of multifamily residential buildings. It's already very difficult for them to comply to mold regulations, water damage regulations. So I want you all to really consider how difficult it's going to be to make them comply to BEPS regulations and standards. So you need to take that into account, because tenants are already advocating for improvements in their own unit. How are we going to get them to listen to renovating a whole entire building? Next thing I want to bring up is tenant empowerment. So in the same vein of how are we going to get them to move, how are we going to get them to act, we need to, I'm proposing some form of tenant petition, where a formal petition that can be downloaded and distributed in the community, getting signatures for a complex, apartment complex, that could then be sent back to some state administration, some state department, saying, hey, tenants here want retrofitting, we want weatherization, we want to be up to these standards, but our property owner is not acting on it. So here is all our voices, help us push them forward. And then lastly, kind of a technical thing on Title 26, Subtitle 28, they talk about which buildings are covered, and it said shared meter. I want to bring up that a lot of affordable housing complexes do have individual meters that track electric and gas use. So I don't want these buildings to be left out, because they'd be just as critical, and BEPS would regularly apply if it weren't for this shared versus individual meter distinction. Thank you.
Nice and clear and brief. Thank you so much. Now we're going to go to people that are online only. And if I mess up these names, please, I'm doing my best. Adama, Haruna, and Tanushree Isaacman.
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, I'm Adama Musa, and I'm with Action in Montgomery. I'm a parent of 3 children, and I have been organizing other parents and tenants for many years to improve our schools and make our community a better place to live for everyone. I'm testifying from my apartment in Montgomery Village, Cider Mill, Montgomery County. And
We're having a little trouble with the audio.
Can you hear me now?
I hear you pretty well now. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so like I was saying, I'm testifying from Montgomery Village, Cider Mill, Montgomery County, and this is my stove, which I turned on 20 minutes ago to make food for my family. When I can manage it, I'll try to cook while my children are at school, so they don't breathe the toxic fume from our gas stove. This is an NO2 meter. You can see this is showing 0.120. I have 2. I put another one in the living room. I don't know if you can see it. So the level of the NO2 that is showing is 0.129 right now. The EPA says that outdoor level over 100 are dangerous to our health. My son have asthma, and the NO2 causes asthma and make it worse. It also affects brain development and other toxin from burning methane or natural gas cause cancer. We have other problem in our apartment, moving from gas to electric appliance, including induction stove and heat pumps, could help improve or solve some of those problems, including toxic mold and unreliable heat. For our sister and brother who live in apartment without air conditioning or window unit, This could help them and reduce their carbon footprints, especially
Thank you.
as our
Could you wrap it up, please?
Our summer are getting harder and harder. The NO2 level you are seeing my screen is not unique. We have measured NO2 level in over 300 apartments and homes. Nearly all have dangerous NO2 level. And we have seen like 50 leaks, gas leaks. We encourage you to support BEPS and close loopholes for tenants living in garden style apartment where the property are more than 3,000 square feet, but not all in the same building. If we want to reduce our carbon footprint,
could you wrap it up in a sentence or two because we're over time?
sure, I just want to add, if we want to reduce our carbon footprint by 2030, we might start with the old apartment building. We want to be part of the solution and we don't want to be left behind. Thank you.
What a nice positive message. Thank you.
Give our speaker applause, and it's amazing that you showed us an NO2 measurement from your home. Bravo.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next up, I have Josh Tolkien from the Sierra Club.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Josh Tolkien. I'm the director of the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club. Thanks for taking my comments today. The Sierra Club is strong supporters of the building energy performance standards. This group has already established the greenhouse gas impetus and the health impetus for this policy. We just want to emphasize that some of the policies that we discussed today are part of the equation. We appreciate the strong penalties that provided disincentive, the transparency, and we applaud MDE and the General Assembly for getting us to this point. We do urge that the General Assembly or MDE look for ways to include more apartments and rental systems in the future. If that's not possible under the limitations of the legislation, then we do urge the General Assembly to go back in the future and think about inclusion of garden style apartments. Ultimately, we also think that this policy needs to be connected to the work of the Building Energy Transition Implementation Task Force, so we can think about other steps that are needed to provide both the funding that is necessary for this work, as well as the protections for tenants and the education necessary so that tenants can become active parts of the solution. As you've seen from the previous speaker, people are enthusiastic to participate in the movement to clean up our buildings. And the more we can connect that to other efforts like removing gold and asbestos and think about a holistic approach to healthy homes, I think we will see strong enthusiasm from the general public. That is what we're seeing, and we're excited to continue to work with you on this policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Next up, we have Theo Butner. Theo, are you on?
Yes. Hi, yes, I'm sorry. It's Teal Butner. I don't need to share any comments with the team at this time.
All right, thank you very much. Next up, Rebecca Rare.
I have her comment because she had to leave, so I'm just going to quick say what she had to say.
Could you just chat them out or text them out? You want to do them?
Oh, she has it. So it's really short.
Go.
Okay. So Rebecca has to say, Maryland LCB would like to thank MDE for these comprehensive efforts and supports promulgation and enforcement of strong standards that meet the urgency of the climate crisis and support local and indoor air quality. We encourage the state to seek federal funding support through IRA and IIJA to support implementation. As a climate justice measure, promulgating BEPS that include all types of multifamily residencies and center on tenant protections will be important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Tom Ballantyne.
Thank you. My name is Tom Ballantyne. I'm here representing NIOP Maryland. We're a commercial real estate trade association representing 22,000 commercial real estate professionals in the U.S. and Canada, some of the largest commercial property owners in the state of Maryland. You have our written letter requesting that the EUI sections of the regulation be removed so that there can be more focus of BEPS on reducing direct building emissions. First, some observations related to the slide decks. The Montgomery County BEPS modeled costs were about $13 a square foot, but individual case studies were closer to $25 per square foot. Our consultants who helped to build the tool used to set targets couldn't recreate the targets that are in the regulation. The adoption curves in the PNL slide decks show very little variation, suggesting that prototypical buildings in the model won't really reflect experience in the field. There's not a wide enough variation. And a large part of the anticipated EUI emissions reductions come from off-site power generation, it's unrelated to direct energy use or direct emissions. The greenhouse gas inventory has always aligned responsibility based on direct emissions. The building sector is responsible for direct emissions generated on site at buildings. Utilities deal with the direct emissions from power generation. Energy efficiency, or EUI, has been addressed through Empower, RGGI, and the Renewable Portfolio Standard. The Climate Solutions Now Act focused on direct emissions, and Michael Powell will talk more about the legal considerations there in a moment. But by regulating EUI, the scope of the requirements nearly double. There are almost 420 million square feet more of commercial space that is served by electric and heating equipment that would be in the regulation. 400 to 500,000 additional condominium and apartment units would be covered in the regulation. Many of those buildings have no direct emissions at all. The challenge to create a technically feasible, cost-effective energy transition for building owners and occupants is immense. And the addition of EUI we don't think was supported by the authority in the law. And as a practical matter, it doesn't belong in the BEPS regulation of direct emissions at the building level. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Next up, I have Michael Powell.
This is Michael Powell. I'll try. You've all seen my letter, so I'll try to be very brief in the 2 minutes. I will say, in 40 years of practice, it's the first time I've ever come to this council and asked them to defer a regulation or a part of regulation. We would ask you not to deny the EUI, but at this time to defer that portion of the regulation until some of the questions that you've been raising are answered. Understand, we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're not talking about millions of dollars. We're talking about billions of dollars that the EUI portion would affect. We're talking about something which the alternative compliance fee does not provide any kind of cap on the cost, whether that was intentional by the General Assembly or accidental, as MDE suggests. We can have that resolved by the General Assembly in just 3 months. Why proceed with something that's going to cost everyone, building owners, small clinics, hundreds of billions of dollars if it's an order of magnitude more than what EPA suggests, and we do think it's orders of magnitude more, without having a chance to answer those questions. I know the issue was raised, well, we got the building transition force is going to recommend some incentives to help reduce the cost. I guarantee the General Assembly is not going to appropriate billions of dollars to reduce these costs, billions of dollars to reduce these costs when it's already facing a significant structural deficit. There's no Attorney General's letter here saying that they must do this in terms of the EUI. You've not had legal advice on that. As you saw from my letter, I would disagree with it. Maybe the courts will have to ultimately decide that. But at the end of the day, you can definitely insist that those questions be looked at before you're required to give advice that the department should proceed. Lastly, I should point out that this is an issue where we're talking about that one part of the regulation doubling the number of buildings that are covered. The department can meet its deadline to get BEPS regulations out by proceeding solely with the non-EUI portion. Get the regulation out, get people started on it. After all, the department says they're going to recalibrate this thing in 2026 anyway. Why rush this through when you got that much?
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Next up, I have Ben Roush.
Good afternoon at this point. I am generally in support of these regulations. They closely align with the original Climate Solutions Now Act, which I advocated for with AIA Maryland. The timeline of the measures allow for natural equipment and material replacement at the end of life for systems. And HVAC and windows are obvious energy upgrades, and they last respectively 20 and 30 years. Some points for improvement. It's not clear how campus systems are handled, our colleges sort of campus systems. I think this is supposed to fall under district energy, and then it's clear that individual buildings must comply. So what is not clear is that district energy systems themselves have to decarbonize, or maybe that's regulated somewhere else. I'd like to see more on that, or at least a point somewhere else. And then on-site renewable, in the definition of EUI, it includes on-site renewable as one of the measures. And then further down, it talks about EUI being energy use only. I'd like clarity on that, because in many ways, buildings getting to the compliance of the EUI targets, which are somewhat strict, are going to take renewable energy, and that might be the cheapest way to get there, to solar the roof. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Scott Waitlever.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. I'm Scott Waitlevich with Columbia Gas of Maryland. Columbia Gas serves about 34,000 residential, commercial, and industrial customers in Allegheny, Garrett, and Washington counties in Western Maryland. On behalf of our customers, we're very concerned about the financial impact of the BEPS regulations. Not only will there be a new cost for utilities to implement the reporting requirements of the regulations, but the administrative and civil penalties and the compliance fees are very concerning and troubling. We have concerns about the impact not only to customers, but energy providers as well. We would request that a regulatory impact analysis be done, if it hasn't been done already, prior to this regulation moving forward. And then finally, we concur with the concerns about the inclusion of the energy use intensity standards. We do not believe that those were mandated by the Climate Solutions Now Act. And we also concur with the recommendation about deferring the vote for further discussion on this. This is a complex and far-reaching set of regulations, and we think they need more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, I have Hannah Allen.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. I'm Hannah Allen. I'm here with the Maryland Chamber of Commerce. Today, I just want to focus my comments on a few specific pieces of the proposed regulation that is before the council for adoption. As it's been mentioned, the draft regulation proposes major changes to the state's building standards and creates significant challenges for existing building owners and businesses. The concern from our members continues to be around the inclusion of energy use intensity standards as a mandate. There are other concerns as well surrounding the overall cost burden and compliance, and that's something that we highlighted in our public comment letter and then the letter that I submitted to the council this morning, specifically that paying an alternative compliance fee is not an option for building owners who fail to meet the EUI standards. It's only an option if they don't meet the required reductions in direct greenhouse gas emissions. The inclusion of regulating emissions from district energy facilities is also a concern to us, as district energy emissions are not direct building emissions. So we feel that the regulations should not be designed to make building owners responsible for off-site emissions. Overall, we believe that the proposed regulations do stretch beyond statutory authority, as including EUI as a mandate is not consistent with the legislative directive. We do ask the council consider deferring action on the provisions that mandate EUI and the inclusion of district energy emissions for further evaluation and discussions and study, and proceed with review of the sections that deal with reducing net direct greenhouse gas emissions as outlined by the Climate Solutions Now Act. Meeting the direct greenhouse gas emissions will be tough enough. So by delaying adoption of the EUI portions, it will allow just more discussion with stakeholders and more studies to be completed before it's considered being included. Thanks, that wraps up my comments. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Todd Nedwick.
Great. Thank you all for the opportunity to comment. My name is Todd Nedwick. I'm with the National Housing Trust. We're a nonprofit affordable housing advocate and housing provider with a portfolio of 450 affordable housing units in Maryland. So we think BEPS is a really important policy tool for accelerating decarbonization and delivering health and economic benefits to residents. And we appreciate the work that has gone into developing the regulations and adding flexibility for affordable housing. However, we have several recommendations for strengthening the regulations. Complying with BEPS will require many affordable housing owners to make significant capital upgrades that are best done as part of a recapitalization. A recapitalization is when a building owner is developing a comprehensive work scope and pursuing new financing sources such as low-income housing tax credits and new first mortgage debt. and recapitalizations typically occur every 15 to 20 years in the life cycle of an affordable multifamily building. Outside of recapitalization, affordable housing owners have very limited access to the financing that they will likely require to pay for the capital upgrades. So the 2-year exemption that currently exists in the regulations for affordable housing does not provide enough flexibility for building owners to align compliance with the recapitalization process. The recapitalization process from pre-development to applying for and securing financing can take 5 to 7 or even more years than that. So rather than a 2-year exemption, we think that MDE should allow building owners to apply for a compliance timeline tailored to their property's financing needs, which is the approach that the state of Colorado is taking. I also want to recommend that affordable housing providers demonstrating a good faith effort to comply do not receive a reduced alternative compliance fee. So again, I want to emphasize that BEPS is a key policy for driving action to address emissions from buildings. We support BEPS. However, we would appreciate some additional flexibility to ensure that affordable housing providers can comply with the requirements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last person is Michael O'Halloran.
Thank you very much. That's an extreme amount of pressure, so I'll be very brief. Look, honestly, I'm just following up on our official comments filed back in the beginning of June. I'll really cater them around the inclusion of EUI as a mandate as opposed to a target, which is clearly written into the statute. Certainly echo a lot of the comments that previous speakers shared, including Mr. Powell, Mr. Ballantyne, and Ms. Allen from the Maryland Chamber of Commerce. I don't think it was the intention of the General Assembly to level these sorts of compliance costs on building owners and therefore tenants. So with that, I would recommend that the council perhaps split the two, if you will, proceed forward if they so choose with the BEPS portion, the greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and separate the building energy performance standard for moving forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Could I have a hand for all these great public comments? And then we'll move to the council for follow-up, any questions, anything, advice where we should go. Sonia?
Based on comment, whether the pro and con, and somebody mentioned earlier about the cost benefit. The data you have, can you do like stratified analysis, like looking at type of building? Because you have aggregate of these building, 9,000 building, and you have the costs for each part, whether investment, whether change. How about having like stratified? How much would it cost for a building where only tenants living, people living there, while it's office building or, the main type of building. So instead having just aggregate for all the buildings.
We can definitely look into that to add to the list of items to look at for the technical support document to beef out the analysis.
Because that helps people when they look at it, and even for the standard, to see what's going to cost them. Because everybody, the bottom line, the main thing is going to be money, billion and whatever. So one way to show it is to give them an idea, depending on the building.
Is that before or after the regulations pass? You would like to see that?
Well, to convince people, I mean, this is important because you're going to have a problem for implementation. We're talking about that too.
So the technical support document as part of the formal regulatory proposal should be expanded to identify buildings.
It would be worth it.
Yeah, well,
because if your data are there, just a question of analysis.
Yeah, we'll follow up with the technical support team to see how much additional, detail we can include in that vein.
Larry?
So I have sort of a process question for John and Chris. So if the council wanted to recommend publication of benchmarking and the greenhouse gas emissions, but to defer the EUI, what kind of motion would we?
Well, I would suggest that we first see if there's anybody makes a motion to amend it, or if the way that it normally works is we work from discussion. So we get someone to make a motion to vote on the rule as presented, and then we get a second on that. And then in discussion, someone can make an amendment to that motion to say, amend it and make it these changes to it, but we can do it in frontwards direction or backwards direction.
So, I mean, I looked at the reg and, you know, rather than saying, you know, delete this column, delete that definition and change this, that's going to be a lot of detailed work. Can the council make sort of a broad recommendation?
Oh, sure.
When I suggested. And
we'd certainly prefer that recommendation be actionable, right? And as you mentioned, there'd be a lot of work. So there is sometimes tension between a broad recommendation and a detailed one, because then there's a lot of interpretation that needs to be done. But
we have 9 minutes to vote. We have 9 minutes to vote. So we're going to do the broad if we do it, if I can guide it correctly. I think you're suggesting something about the EUI. Is that what you're talking about, or something beyond?
I guess if I were to make a motion, it would be in the form of that the council recommend proceeding with the benchmarking and the greenhouse gas emissions portions of the reg, but defer the EUI material.
Can I get feedback from other council members on that potential motion? Mr. Hobbs? Good. Varls?
I would support something of that spirit.
Thank you.
So I'd like to know from Mark and Allison, so there's just so many balls in the air with this in my mind. So I see there's a column here, the final standard for 2040 and beyond for EUI, but the regulation has interim standards, and the interim standards are only for net direct emissions, but there is an interim for EUI.
There is, it's just
written down.
It's written in a formula that's in the technical manual. So again, each individual building has to establish its baseline EUI and then draw a straight line between its baseline and the final EUI in 2040 and make progress along that line essentially in 2030 and 2035.
Okay, so with all due respect, and people say that in scorn, but I am the opposite. With tremendous, okay, that does seem a little silly, because another way you could do it is you could say you establish a baseline, you have oversight, whatever, and then you have to come down by a certain amount by the interim period and another amount by the end. Because here, if your baseline is super high because of what you're doing, you know, you just, the nature of the building, you still have to come to the same baseline as someone who's already there. Like, again, it just doesn't kind of make sense the way it's laid out. So why was it laid out this way? Was there a good reason?
Well, you're kind of challenging the general nature of these building performance standards as they've emerged, because what happens almost exclusively across the board is that for each property type, there's a median of either EUI or emissions that's determined. So right off the bat, you've got, if you are significantly above the median, you may have more to do to achieve whatever the standard is. So that's kind of the you know, the groundwork, really, the foundation of how these standards are set.
Can I just jump in just to move things along? So when we're talking about this motion and that process, right? And if we were to defer it, we're not saying we're voting it down. We're saying take more time to discuss, but I don't understand how we can advise the department to move forward when they've done outreach. So
So the numbers here are based on real data from Montgomery County mainly, or from higher out?
From across the state, and with as Josh mentioned, with filling some gaps in data from other data sets.
So I have a contrary view to my esteemed colleagues. I don't think we should defer it, but I think we should build in some more flexibility to it. It's too severe in some ways, like some more case by case. Like, could we possibly have our cake and eat it too? That if you don't meet it, you have to, go through, you're in violation, as opposed to, we'll have a review and we'll work. We all want to work together, bring this forward, and we don't prefer to go to court.
And what I heard the reaction from the director was they don't have that option. They have non-compliance and a non-compliance policy and protocols that they would follow. And in that protocol and policy, they have considerable flexibility how it moves forward, but it would still be non-compliance. Does
That is
that
a
summarize
case
it?
by case, and that is a case by case basis, much like the EUI targets, which are set. Each building would be subject to it individually. It would sort of meet them where they are today, and by today I mean 2025, and they would have their own target, and that would account for, you know, some of the elements of the law that require us to look at different building needs and regional variations. Since I've got the floor, I do want to just make the council aware on the legal side. The commenters offered very nuanced written comments. It may not have come across in the written or in the spoken comments because it was short, but EUI targets are a legally required element of the regulations. The Climate Solution Now Act says we have to promulgate these regulations. As part of the regulations, we must establish EUI targets by building type. So MD is not doing this for fun, not extra credit. They are required to be part of the regulation.
That's why our motion has to be clear on, we're not voting against it. If we're deferring it, we should at least have a 30-second conversation on what that means if you defer it.
So what does that mean? You said the legislation requires you to have targets. Do those targets have to be hard targets, or could they be of the form that Ross suggested?
The law requires us to issue a regulation, and regulations are, as you all aware, mandatory measures, right? Regulations are not voluntary programs. And so the department did the most straightforward interpretation, which is that we're putting these numbers in regulations, and regulations are regulations. We understand that there's a lot of work that needs to be worked out in implementation, that we need to revisit these once we have actual benchmarking data. But our approach in the reg is the most straightforward one, which is a regulation includes numbers, and regulations are by definition mandatory.
And to follow up on Ross, didn't I see that 2025 you got data and 2026 you revisit the standard?
Yeah, the department, yes, that's right, the department plans.
It's not like it's going to be revisited. It's not like if we vote on it now and if it's accepted, you know, that it's written in stone, so.
Yeah, I hear all that. I'm just, there are many, I think there are many ways you could get this in place by having buy-in from more people than are buying in today. You know, another way perhaps is aggregating. So, you know, we all want the energy use intensity to go down. If for some reason this welding shop just can't do it, but they can aggregate with their next door neighbor, which is the yoga place. And so they can share resources. So from that footprint, square footage, we're good, but they're bad here and they're good there. I mean, I'm just making stuff up, but it just seems so severe. Is there any kind of flexibility you could think of to bring in during the public comment period that would?
Really narrowly on that example, we built in that flexibility in the way of creating area weighted averages. So if you have that welding shop next to the yoga studio all in one building where those are two different tenants in the building is needing to comply to a EUI and emission standard that is based on the blended emissions and EUI standards of those two property types.
I did my best to get through it.
So where are we? What do we think? Any more questions? I'm inclined, my personal view is I'm inclined to say, it looks like the EUI is the part that's a problem, and I could support a motion to defer that part if I knew how the department could possibly respond to that. So if we're just deferring it to delay it, it doesn't make sense. What would we be asking the department to do in that thing? And they think they have a firm statutory requirement to move forward with that. So if we were to take that potential proposal, and it's good for me to wait for Larry to get back so he can reply. And I think, Ben, you were somewhat supportive of that. What is the guidance we give them? Or we're going to come back next month without Quinn and talk about it again and defer it again, or we're going to accept it then with no real change. I just don't know what we're asking if we defer. Could we discuss that in some way? Even department opinions I'm interested in.
I mean, the department would prefer not to be in the position of proposing a regulation with a legally required element missing and having to come back and fill that in before, before something happens. So, we'd prefer to put the entire package out at once and satisfy the requirements. Understanding that we are coming back at this and it'll be a process.
So how would the folks who are doing this full time feel about if you don't sort of tell someone they're not in compliance, instead of meeting the median, if they're within one standard deviation of the mean above the median? That gives like a little wiggle. I'm looking for a little wiggle room. Like if you're within one standard deviation of the mean above the median, then we're going to just work with you to come down further. For people who are they're coming down, they're making good faith efforts. I don't know if the people who can hear my voice would buy into this or not. I'm looking for a compromise that can have our cake and eat it too.
So with all this discussion, so these EUI standards currently are based off of all those like available data, right? So is it possible that once we establish the baseline, then we will know like what they're like the distribution of the real EUI at the time? So could we put like one caveat, maybe at that time we can reevaluate with real data to come up with the better like standards, or is it like once you set the standards and that's it? How is it working?
So we can't say in the regulation that these are, draft numbers, right? That we have to set standards in a regulation, but we are throughout our technical guidance and public materials very clear that these standards are going to be revisited. The first year that, it's not until 2030 that there's any compliance required. It would be 2031 until anyone would be subject to any sort of payment. So, we know that we will be revisiting this regulation.
You can't put in the regulation that the numbers will be revised based on data available in early 2026.
So it's stated in the technical manual. And
yeah, but when you put it in the regulation?
Our guidance was to not write that in the regulation.
I think that's a suggestion, is to put it right in the regulation and subsequently revised based on data available in 2026.
I feel like Randy may have something to say about the department regulating itself in this.
Well, that's correct. The department, within a regulation, we don't regulate ourselves. So that's just one of the features. But as Mark just mentioned, that the statement that the department is going to come back and review these numbers is in the technical memorandum. And the technical memorandum is an incorporated part of the regulation. So in a sense, we are mentioning that process will play out.
We are losing members.
For voting's sake.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, Megan.
That's okay. Do we want to take a quick vote before I leave, or?
You're making the motion for what?
Accept.
The rule as is.
As is.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Second.
You go with Sun, he's second.
All right, further discussion? I would like to amend it to add an amendment, which is a separate motion, amendment to defer the EUI part and see what they can't work out to accommodate people's concerns.
Second.
Can we vote on that amendment first? Would that be okay? What do you think, Megan, about that amendment?
That amendment's fine.
To defer. And what, let's vote the way around.
I think we need clarification.
There was two.
Oh,
Yeah.
no, well, we had the original motion. I modified the amendment before the motion. So we're talking about the amendment to the original motion was accept as presented. I asked for a modification and we're voting on the modification to accept as submitted with the change that the EUI portion would be deferred.
I vote no then, sorry.
Yeah, I vote
Glad you
no.
clarified.
You're voting?
No.
Okay.
Because we know, they will work on later anyhow to revisit those numbers. So at this point, we'll just move with whatever it is proposed.
Good explanation. How about,
Motion I seconded. Can we vote on the amendment?
yeah, we are voting on the amendment. And they just both voted against. And everyone else voted for, I think, but we'll come back.
We're going to do a roll call vote?
Yes. All right, we'll do it. So the amendment to pass the rule as submitted, and the amendment is to defer the EUI portion of that.
You're just voting on the amendment, not.
Just on the amendment. Just on the amendment.
So you're saying who's in favor?
Yes, I'm in favor. There's six. And then who was opposed? And that's 4. So that motion carries.
Secondary motion.
Carries. So now we go back to the passing the thing with this amendment. All in favor?
I want to speak. I'm not in favor of it. You've just taken the teeth out of it. Let's just defer the whole thing. You've just pulled the rug out from under it. So if we're gonna, I think you're making an enormous amount of work for Mark. And Chris.
That'd make it tied.
On the room.
It's the amendment, so.
I'd like to hear their opinion on this. I would rather just kill it, the whole thing now, and come back and revisit it than force them to split it and then come back. But what's your view?
We love coming and talking to AQCAC. I think.
Thank you.
Not having to revisit it would probably be the department's opinion. We're overdue on adopting this regulation already.
But the EUI is already in the reg. Is that correct? So
It's in here, and what we're saying is, what the amendment does, what we're suggesting is refine the EUI to address people's concern, but the reduction and the inventory and the reporting would move forward.
yeah, but regulating the EUI, it's already mandatory.
Go ahead, Larry.
So taking a step back, we're an advisory council. And frankly, what we do is not binding on the department. Usually they follow our advice. I think, I mean, I understand what you're saying, Ross, to take some of the teeth out. But I think this as a recommendation reflects what I've heard from a number of the commenters and certainly my own discomfort with the UI portion of it. So it's a recommendation to the department saying, I know it's a lot of work, but you got work to do on that part of it.
And I agree with you that they do, and that's why I'm kind of struggling with, can we make something happen between now and the public comment? I mean, there are changes. We're not voting on every single number here, because believe me, if we were, we'd be here for a long time. What I'm suggesting is try to come up with a compromise where the majority of the vociferous opposition of this would say, okay, that makes sense. I just offered there, instead of meeting a single number, you're within one standard deviation of it. So you have some flexibility that moves us in the right direction. But that was a very different proposal than just tabling it, because we only meet quarterly. So I would suggest you just move ahead regardless of what we suggest. But seek the compromise. But seek the compromise.
My concern is there's no path forward, is what I've heard from outside commenters. There's no path forward to meet the regulation. They don't feel the regulation can be met without being out of compliance. It might be a minor out of compliance. It might be a major. My history in the private sector is we would rather have a lot of requirements than to have even one notice of violation. This would give you a notice of violation in multiple cases, is what I'm hearing from that. And there should be an alternative compliance mechanism, just like there is for the other. I know you said you don't have that thing. That's why, is there some way we can work on that to appease those individuals?
I'm saying the same thing that I was trying to say, but much better. I'm in agreement.
Yeah, it's silly. I'll just say the one, your last meeting, you get to say, it's silly that you can't include on-site renewables. It's just silly. That's just, that would be what we should drive this forward, right? You have rooftop solar.
Solar hot water heaters for restaurants reduces your gas usage by a factor of 2.
All right, but that's editorial. I'm sorry, I drifted.
That's a narrower amendment, I think.
Yes. Well, I think you said you cannot do that.
It sounds to me that the council wants to make a recommendation to the General Assembly. And
Yes, but we're working on the regulation today, and I editorialized and I was off track. I continue to think we have 6-5 on the vote because Tom Dranoga already sent his vote in. So 6-5, we have 2, 4.
Four.
Tom Dranoga voted.
What, did we see Dranoga raise his hand?
We're including him. Is that right? 6-5, and that's the council's recommendation. What I hear now, I'm willing to talk more and we have another vote, change it, but that's what we have on the table.
Passed.
Well, the amendment to the motion passed. I guess the chair, do we need to vote on the ultimate motion? Call the question, final motion.
No. I think okay, we do?
We could vote on the main motion, and the main motion could fail, and we have to go back.
All right.
On the motion, I don't know.
Well, so the main motion is, so we have to go back, even though we amended it?
Yeah, so now we're voting, I think, on whether to pass this without the EUI in it.
Okay.
Right.
So that motion already made and seconded. All in favor? Passing it as presented, they want to vote on.
Passing it as without the amendment.
With the amendment.
With the amendment, I'm not going to vote it.
Yeah, passing with the amendment. That's what I thought, but I thought you just told me I couldn't do that.
No, I said.
Yeah, I misunderstood. So we're looking to vote on
The amended main motion.
the amended main motion.
So this is to recommend the department move forward with the regulation, deferring the EUI portion of the program.
All in favor of moving forward with the deferral as part of the regulation? Right? All in favor? There, you done?
I'm going to abstain.
Okay. All opposed? Okay.
I think I'm changing my vote to no for the amendment, so.
Well, that accomplishes the same thing. So now we have
Down as abstention,
yes.
main motion.
All right, so now we are back to,
That was 4 yes, 4 no, 1 abstention.
so we're back
Have to run, Deputy Director.
Oh, do you have to? No to that or no go?
So that way, we're going to continue to try to get a vote.
Dranoga what?
Appreciate that. I'm really sorry. I do have to run.
No, go, thank you.
Bernoga and Ladshaw voted as proposed.
Okay, right. I understand.
Meaning with the amendment or without the amendment?
Without the amendment.
Without.
But we're not, that wasn't,
Without the amendment.
that's not what we're voting on.
They
Right.
changed their vote. Now I think we are
Clarifying.
higher vote on.
Will you what? What do you suggest now? How do we move forward? There's no more votes. We want to do a vote as
What was the result of the second vote?
4-4-1.
Okay, that's
Didn't you get
interesting.
Megan vote?
Tell me, somebody over there, tell me where we are in that vote.
Did you get extra
I
vote?
think a 4-5.
No, I'm sorry, when you just 1 minute ago or so, right, John was right, the 4 yes, 4 no, and 1 abstain. What we're recording. And then, I'm sorry?
And I changed her vote, right?
Yes.
So you counted that? She changed it yes to no.
Wouldn't we have to have another motion? If somebody wants to change a vote, wouldn't we have to have another motion?
Yeah, we're not talking about the first vote again because that was already done. But her second vote, when she came and she said she did not want to see the deferral in it, she didn't vote for that to pass. It effectively changed her initial vote. because she no longer supports the amendment, but the amendment didn't pass. So we can go back and do, because I'll take a motion to accept the rule as proposed again, if you'd like to do that.
So I have a thought. It seems to me like the main motion failed is what I hear. So we're back to ground zero.
Yes.
That's what I think, where I think we are. What about a motion that defers the interim targets for EUI, which Ross expressed some concern with?
Or modifies, not defers, but modifies to create a bit of some flexibility that's data driven. That's what I would.
We could do a recommendation that Maryland go to the General Assembly and modify that, because they're saying they have no choice.
They have no choice on the interim targets?
I think they have a lot of
Scott Thompson
choice.
here to pick up Michael Thompson.
Do you have choice on the interim targets? Or does legislation require you to have interim targets?
The only interim target that was set by statute is the 2030 target for net direct emissions. The interim targets for 2035 for emissions and for 2030 and 2035 for EUI was at the department's discretion to set those interim targets.
So there were no interim targets required by the legislation for EUI?
No.
And I just am, again, I'm repeating myself for, I guess, emphasis. I'm really just want there to be some data-driven flexibility in it where you can get more people buying into your approach.
So it sounds like a motion would be in order to approve the regulation but without the interim EUI targets.
No, that's not what I'm saying. With more flexibility.
How would you say that?
You're in compliance if you're within one standard deviation of the mean added to the median. And I'm being very technical because you compute standard deviations of the mean. So you take that number, which anybody with Excel can do, you add it to the median. And if you're that good, you're in compliance just for the interval. Let's just baby step it, just for the interval.
There are others in the room that have, including you all, that have a lot more experience with our standards setting process and regulations. I mean, the department's norm, I think, and Angelo or.
I think, if I might, so it seems like we're not all moving forward. We want to pass this right as is, but we're close. And what do we want to modify? What do we want to suggest as modification? One thing we can modify to make it easier to comply with.
And I know it's not satisfactory to know, as Chris was talking about earlier, that there's an entire process that our compliance team goes through to find a workable solution for a covered entity. We can't say in advance what that solution might look like because there's a process established to do that, but there's certainly flexibility within that as a norm.
But could you do something for the interim compliance things and compliance targets? Couldn't you have them, if they don't meet it, they submit a plan for compliance to meet it rather than make them out of compliance? That's what you were just saying.
Yeah, and that would be at the discretion of the compliance team.
What do you think?
I mean, that's the standard practice for, stack test, stack
It works for me.
violations.
Yeah.
So rather than, we could put a positive statement that not meeting interim targets for the EUI requires a plan for compliance submittal within what time frame? 3 months of reporting. 6 months of reporting.
Okay.
This doesn't address my concern with the lack of alternative compliance payments, meaningful ones, so.
Right, well, we could make a separate motion about urging alternative compliance pathway to be placed in the legislation. But let's just do this one first. I just want to see if we can move forward on either. This is the kind of thing that, would you be open to that?
There's conflict in the two recommendations that you're suggesting for the council, though. if the council were to recommend that the General Assembly give us the authority to set a clean and reasonable alternative compliance payment process for the EUI, that would be in conflict with the idea that if you're not in compliance with the EUI, you need to.
No, because you could do, your plan for compliance would be to use the alternative compliance pathway by Rex.
Yeah, which would be the simpler approach for sure. I don't mean to support the idea of rec purchases at the compliance pathway, but the ACP payment, which the statute requires the ACP payment on the emissions side. It's a very straightforward approach. If you're above your target, the increment.
But then I'll pull that back because that's a two-step thing. I'll make a motion that instead of having the targets removed, that we pass the regulations as proposed, removing the EUI non-compliance for not meeting the EUI targets and rather requiring a plan for compliance within 3 months of reporting the non-compliance. And what do people feel about that? Anyone want to second that or talk about it?
Might want to repeat it.
Yes. So the motion is to approve the regulations as presented with the change that not meeting the EUI targets, interim targets, would require submittal of a plan for compliance within 3 months.
That's reasonable. That's reasonable. Is it doable?
It's a significant administrative burden to receive and review thousands of alternative compliance plans. And again, your recommendation that the General Assembly provide an ACP route, simple and reasonable payment in lieu of compliance. If that came into play, I think that would be opposed to the idea that there be a unique compliance plan developed by each individual covered building that wants to seek it and review from our.
The department could pursue that on their own as a remedy, because what we recommend is just advisory and it handles the problem today, is why I like the idea that we take action that tries to address the concerns today.
Our assistant director would like to go. The General Assembly has the 2040 Dayton, right? They don't tell you anything about interim.
They set the interim target for 2030. Compliance must begin in 2030 according to the law.
Must begin.
Yep.
Okay, but the final number is 2040.
Yes, they said 2040 is the final standard.
The direct line is your interpretation.
Well, so one thing I wanted to just make sure was emphasize that also is modeled based on Montgomery County's approach to their EUI standard requirements. So we did try to align with the county's requirement relating to EUI standards.
The direct line.
They are using the trajectory approach as we've outlined. So we tried to be in as close alignment as a legislation that enables this. And there's,
Well, but the straight line would require people to put equipment in sooner, but that 2035 EUI target might say now you could make the choice now to do the replacement of equipment in 2034. But with the straight line transition, you might have to put it in 2030 or 2029. And that's what I think the flexibility of making a plan for compliance say, I'm not going to make the 2030, but I'm going to make the 2035 easily because I'm going to do my plan for compliance is put the equipment in 2033. That's kind of where I'm coming from on this. And yes.
I guess the reason that we linked those in terms of having interim targets, starting in 2030 as required by the law for the emissions target, and then just phasing in for 2035 to create a path.
I was making up the dates just to illustrate. I'm sorry.
These things are linked as a building is reducing its direct emissions to achieve the required 2030 target. it will also be improving its site EUI. There's no two ways about that. If you're removing combustion equipment to achieve a direct emissions target, you will necessarily be improving your site EUI as you replace efficient with efficient electric.
Sounds like we're talking past each other, which is a little frustrating. Yes, but if you started as the bad boy or girl of, and you're doing that, you come down to so you might have a 50% reduction from where you were to 2030, but because you started so high, because for whatever you're doing there, you're being forced to be to the group median so soon that I think that's some of the resistance that we might be hearing. I'm just striving for.
Yeah, but let me get back to that. But Megan, the Assistant Director, would like to speak.
Yes, hello everyone. Apologies that I couldn't be there in person today. John had asked for the department's opinion on doing the advanced compliance plan. And I think Mark summed it up pretty well, but I just wanted to go back to something that was brought up earlier in the meeting, that we're looking at 9,000 buildings in the state. And we did not receive any additional resources from the General Assembly for our compliance program to implement these regulations. So I just wanted to put that out there, that it would be considerable effort on the department's part to do a compliance plan for, however many buildings applied if they couldn't meet the EUI targets. And that's all I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I have a motion on the table that as stated, to allow a plan for compliance. Anybody want to second it? Pardon me, say it again. Yeah, so the motion is to approve the regulations as presented with the addition as an option for a plan for compliance for missing the EUI targets, and it has to be submitted within 3 months of reporting the EUI noncompliance.
So the interim targets only, or all the targets, or including the final?
Interim.
The interim targets.
Interim only.
Because that's not in the regulation, that's a straight line interpolation, and that's what the problem is to me.
And then the department says they don't have a budget or staff to review those plans for compliance. So that's, to me, that's tantamount to eliminating the interim requirements.
I'll second the motion.
Any further discussion?
If this is in the advice, can they say no and do what?
They can say no to anything we say. We're advisory.
Okay, I'll go with it. It's an advisory. So it's up to them to.
We're just saying we don't want people to be out of compliance on this.
Despite all of the 50-50 almost votes, +1, -1, I think we're all in agreement that we need to do something about the EUI that will build community support from those affected by this. And I think that's the message. No? Okay.
Well, we have a motion on the table in a second. Any further discussion? The people on the online, I'm sorry, I haven't been watching if you've been raising your hand or trying to speak. No, I'm not hearing any further discussion. All in favor of the motion on the table?
With the modification.
Please repeat the motion.
The motion is to approve the regulations as presented with the addition of an option for a plan for compliance for not meeting the interim EUI targets. And that plan for compliance would have to be submitted within 3 months of reporting non-compliance.
Okay. So to make sure I understand, any recommendation about going back to the legislature about alternative compliance would have to be a separate motion then?
Correct. Because it's not something more, that would just be an advisory opinion. That's less effective than this, to me.
So I'm going to abstain on the vote, but it just doesn't make sense to me to require something that the department can't review. And,
Can reject. You can say no, they want to reduce.
well, so that's like either keeping it in or taking it out.
All right. Only thing that does plan for compliance is the typical way that enforcement actions are taking for non-compliance. I'm speaking almost for the department in this case, so overtalk me if necessary. And this would just remove the stigma of non-compliance. So if they couldn't meet it anyway, this would make them not subject to fines if they submit a plan.
I like it, Larry, because despite the fact that MDE is not appropriately staffed and budgeted for this now, let's face it, for this to actually happen the way it's been presented to us, that's going to have to change. I mean, so, either, they will go to the legislature and say, look, you really want this to happen, we need people to go do inspections, or we need to have some more staff to review these. So I'm in the interest of compromise, and also it's now 12:31. I knew we were going to go to 12:30.
So all in favor of the motion? Larry, you're abstaining? All right, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to 1. And then, are any opposed? No. I think you can consider how Tom and Megan would view this. This is pretty strong result, 7 to 1, that we think there should be a message to the department that we're worried about the compliance status of a lot of facilities. And that's really our point. We think you did a lot of work, and I know they're important. I know it was required in statute, but thank you for listening to us and not objecting to us trying to find some small improvement.
Thank you for all your work.
Yeah.
Thank you.
He has to leave with a bang,
Thank you, everybody. It was a great time, and thanks for the plaque. I had a great time. Unless someone objects, a meeting's adjourned? Good, you're done? You're done. We're done.
I think we're done.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Congrats, John.